Amish Barn Murders, written by Samantha Price, narrated by Sarah Morrissey. Chapter 1. It was slow at the market, and Thea Hersh had only sold 6 cheeses, rather than the 20 she would have sold by this time on a normal day. It seemed as though people had vanished all of a sudden. Slow day. On hearing a deep voice next to her, Thea looked to her side at the young Englishman who ran the stall next to her. Her father had warned her not to speak to any of the stall holders who weren't Amish, but she couldn't be rude. She smiled at the relatively new stall holder she'd only spoken to a handful of times in the past weeks. He continued, "I haven't seen this place so quiet since I've been here." "I know what you mean," Thea replied. "And I came here this morning hoping to make a tidy sum today, but it seems I'll have to wait until tomorrow." He took a step toward her. "Did you want the money for something special?" Thea looked at the young man. Her father's warning about keeping separate from the Englishers rang in her ears. But she was only talking to him. Many in her community had to speak to the Englishers during the course of their business. Thea's gaze turned up to the sky. "I need to get my bike fixed." "What's wrong with it?" He took 2 more steps until he was standing in front of her and offered his hand. "I'm Austin, by the way." She shook his hand and looked into his kind brown eyes. "I'm Thea." "I know," he said. "I've heard your father speak to you." "You're new here, aren't you?" "Yes, we had a stall on the roadside, but we're hoping to sell more here with all of the people going by on foot. So what's wrong with your bike?" "I think the wheel is twisted. Well, it's looked that way for some time, but I was still able to ride it. But now I can't. Now I have to walk everywhere." "Can't your boyfriend fix it for you?" Thea smiled and felt her cheeks flush. "I don't have one." "What about your father?" "I daren't ask him to do one more thing. He's so tired when he gets home at night." "I could fix it for you." "You could? Are you sure?" Austin smiled, his brown eyes crinkling at the corners. "I'm pretty handy with things like that. I fixed my own bikes and my brother's bikes. Bring it in with you tomorrow and I'll take a look at it." "Really?" "Yeah." "Thank you so much, Austin." Taya stepped sideways and her cheese display tilted, beginning to topple over. Austin lunged forward and grabbed the stack of cheeses before they fell on the ground. "Good catch. Thank you." Austin had the cheeses balanced against his midsection, and Taya leaned forward to take them from him. When they were standing close together with only the cheeses in between them, Taya's friend Thomas appeared. The pair jumped apart, causing the cheeses to fall on the ground. Thomas glared at Austin and then looked at Taya. "What's going on here?" "See what you've done, Thomas?" Taya bit her lip. She was always accused of speaking first and thinking later. Thomas, being taller than most men, looked down at Austin. "Stay away from Taya." "He's got a stall here and he was just helping me." "Look after your own stall," Thomas said to Austin. "Thanks for your concern, but I believe I didn't catch your name," Austin said. Glaring at Thomas for his uncalled-for rudeness, Taya said, "Austin, this is Thomas. Thomas, this is Austin." "My father will be here soon, Thomas." Taya knew Thomas and her father did not get along very well. She wasn't sure why. All Taya knew was that something had once happened between Thomas and Grace, one of her older sisters, before Grace had gotten married. Thomas crossed his arms in front of his chest. "That's good. I'll wait for him. Shall I tell him what I saw between you two?" Austin walked a few steps back to his stall, ignoring Thomas's comments. "Nothing was going on. The cheese fell. Austin caught it, and I was taking it back from him. There was nothing happening at all," Taya insisted. "Is that right, Queen Bee? That's what you must be to have all that honey. Did you have your worker bees make it for you?" Thomas walked over to Austin and deliberately knocked into his display of honey, and the jars toppled over and landed on the table. Austin hurried to steady the bottles. He caught all but one that toppled out of his hands and smashed on the ground. That got the attention of other stall holders and some customers. Everyone looked over at the two boys while Thea looked on in horror. "You'd better go home and collect more honey from your bees, Queen Bee." Austin stepped up to Thomas and looked up into his face. "I killed the last person who called me Queen Bee." Thomas laughed and stepped away. Thea rushed over to stand between the two men. "Thomas, look what you've done." She pointed to the ground and the broken jar of honey. Thomas shouted, "He threatened me and you heard him." "Leave him be. Why are you here anyway?" Thea demanded. "I'm picking up a couple of things. I didn't come here to have my life threatened." Thea looked over at Austin, who was doing his best to pick up the broken glass and sticky honey. When she turned back to Thomas, she said, "Well, if you don't want anything, please go." Thomas looked over his shoulder at Austin, sniggered, and walked away. Thea grabbed a box of tissues that she had behind her stall, leaned down, and helped Austin wipe the honey from the ground. "Sorry about that, Austin. He can be unreasonable at times." "I thought Amish people were peace-loving and all that." "They are. They mostly are, except for him. I don't know what gets into him sometimes. He's been funny since he got back from his Rumspringa." "Have you thought that maybe it's jealousy?" "No, I don't think so." Thea looked at Austin and saw a little smile on his face. But he kept quiet. 6 o'clock rolled around and the stall holders packed up, as the market was now closed. Even though Thea hadn't sold very much that day, she had enjoyed Austin's company after Thomas had left. Thea's father Levi showed up a little earlier than usual. "Go to the buggy now, Thea. I'll finish packing up." "It's okay, Dot. I can do it. You wait for me. I'll be out soon." It was usual for her father to wait for her in the buggy, and she normally wheeled the leftover goods out to him when she was ready. Levi looked over at Austin, and from the way he stared at him, Thea knew that Thomas had spoken to her father about the altercation earlier that day. "Don't believe everything you hear, Dot. Thomas was here, making trouble." Turning around to look at his daughter, Levi ordered, "Go to the buggy, Thea, and wait for me there." Thea drew her eyebrows together, looked at her father, and then glanced back at Austin. She walked away, not daring to say goodbye to her new friend. Instead of going directly to the buggy, Thea watched from a distance, hoping her father wouldn't have words with Austin. She was right to be concerned. She saw and heard her father speaking with the young man. Austin was visibly shaken and nodded as her father spoke. Her father was not yelling, but was speaking loud enough to attract the attention of the other workers who stopped to see what the commotion was. Thea heard her father say, "Stay away from my daughter. I don't want to see or hear that you've talked to her again." Austin nodded. Then her father said, "I heard what happened, and I won't have my daughter put in the middle of an argument." "I wasn't doing anything wrong. The cheese toppled over and I was helping her." "Save your stories. I don't want you to speak to her again." "I have the stall next to hers. I'll most likely see her tomorrow." A baker nearby heard the ruckus and stepped up. "What's going on, Levi?" "This young man has been disrespectful to Thea." The baker looked at the young man and then looked at Levi. "I'm sure it won't happen again." "It won't happen again," Austin said with an emphatic nod as he appeared to be growing more frustrated. As Levi finished packing the cheeses, he turned around and caught sight of Thea. He narrowed his eyes and pointed outside to where the buggy was. Thea obeyed immediately, and as she walked out to the buggy, she hoped the situation would calm down. She'd never heard her father raise his voice before. Neither had she heard him say things of that nature to anyone. It made her wonder what Thomas could have possibly said to her father that made him so cross. Chapter 2. The next day, Ettie Smith, an elderly Amish woman, was in her kitchen putting the finishing touches on her apple pie. She was just about to place it in the heated oven when she heard familiar footsteps thumping quickly through the house. Only moments before, her older sister, Elsa May, had headed out the door for a walk with her small dog, Snowy, before the evening air got too cold. "What is it?" Ettie asked as she turned to see a distraught Elsa May leaning against the kitchen doorway. "There's been a death." Ettie stared at Elsa May, scared to ask who it was. By the look of Elsa May, she was upset, but not as devastated as she would be if it were a close family member. Elsa May was still standing squarely in the doorway in her black lace-up boots. "Who?" "Young Thomas Strongberg." "Nay." Etty had been expecting another elderly person, another of their friends to have fallen off the perch. Not a strong, healthy young man like Thomas Strongberg. "Yeah, he fell off a ladder in his barn." "And he died from the fall?" Elsa May nodded, wiping her eyes. "It was an accident." "How did you hear this?" "Snowy and I got to the end of the road, and Nancy Miller was driving past in her buggy. She stopped and told me, and she said she'd heard it from Doris Weiberger." Etty frowned and looked back at her uncooked pie. It was a sad thing when a young person died before they'd lived out their life to reach old age. She picked up a fork and pressed the prongs against the edges of the pastry to make a nice pattern. "Don't you care, Etty?" Etty turned back to look at her sister. "I care, but what can I do?" "We can visit his family. That's what we can do." "Give it a day or two." Etty finished decorating the edge of her pie, opened the oven door, and slid the pie onto the middle rack. Elsa May spat out, "That's what I meant." "I'm not arguing with you." "Good." "Do you think it's true?" Etty asked. "I do. Doris wouldn't have made something like that up." "I don't mean that. I know Doris wouldn't make something up. I meant about Thomas falling off a ladder to his death. When was the last time someone was killed by falling off a ladder?"
"It's possible to die from a fall."
Etty raised her eyebrows. "Seems odd to me, that's all. I would have thought he'd get a broken arm or a broken leg."
"They say he landed on his head, and that's what killed him."
News had always traveled through the Amish community at lightning speed, and it didn't take long for the talk to spread amongst the Amish that Thomas Strongberg was found dead in his family's barn. Rumors spread that an Englishman at the farmer's market had threatened him the day he died. Old Doris Weiberger had stopped by Thea's house to tell the family the dreadful thing that had happened to the Strongberg family. Thea was in tears. She'd only seen Thomas the day before at the market. Even though their friendship had been rocky in the recent past, he was still a friend that she'd grown up with. When Doris left the house, Thea's father told Thea,
"It's no secret that Thomas and I haven't always seen eye to eye about things. But Thomas told me that the young man at the market had threatened to kill him. I can't have you around that man again. We'll have to see about getting your stall moved."
"Nay, Dot, Austin didn't mean it. That was only because Thomas was being mean to him. Anyway, Thomas was well over 6 feet tall, and Austin could only be about 5 feet 9 or 10. I don't think that Austin would have been able to overpower someone like Thomas, if that's what you're thinking."
"I told you no good would come of speaking to the Englishers."
"He said hello, and I said hello back, and that's all. Surely there's no harm in that. I've got to be friendly, don't I? And my regular customers know where I am. It'll be a huge financial risk to move the stall." Her father remained silent. Thea continued. Anyway, everyone speaks to Englishers. Mom says it's all right as long as we don't become friends with them. Her mother, who was sitting alongside Thea, nodded.
What else has Mom always told you?
She said something about the wheat mixing with the chaff.
That's right, Thea. Don't make friends with them, was what your mother meant.
Yeah, that's what I meant, Thea.
Levi glared at his wife. Hush.
A chill ran through Thea. She'd never heard her father speak harshly to her mother, and he had never hushed her. Her mother was upset. She stood and hurried out of the room. Thea would go to her as soon as she finished setting her father straight about Austin. Austin offered to fix my bike. He's only been nice to me.
What's wrong with your bike?
I'm not sure. It's not working.
I'll fix it.
You will? Denke.
Yeah, I'll fix it by throwing it on the scrap heap. I'll take it to the recycling center.
Nay, Dad, it's still usable. It just needs fixing. Unless you're thinking of buying me a new one? He shook his head.
You need to be punished for disobeying me. You're too big to take the strap to, so I'll take your bike away instead.
Thea looked at her hands in her lap. Her father had always threatened to take a strap to her and her sisters, but had never done it. He'd never treated her 4 older sisters this bad before they'd left home to get married.
I didn't feel right about that boy. He's got the devil in him.
You mean Thomas or Austin?
Her father nodded. Maybe both of them. Thomas changed somewhere along the way. Well, I guess we've got a funeral to go to this week.
Thea stood up and, risking another outburst from her father, she said, You don't like Austin, and you didn't even like Thomas. You don't like anyone. With that said, Thea rushed out of the house to the barn. She unloaded the cheese from the large cold box into the chilled cartons in the back of the buggy that they carried the goods to the market in. A little later, Thea crept back into the house to see if her mother was still in the kitchen. She'd gone, and her father was nowhere to be seen either. They'd both gone to bed and left a sole light burning in the kitchen for her return. Her father never said anything about her heated words and drove her to the market in silence the next morning. She wheeled her goods in and unpacked them, just as she'd done every other day. Austin arrived a little after she had. Austin, did you hear what happened?
What?
Thomas has died.
The man who knocked over my stuff?
Thea nodded.
How? He looked healthy.
I don't know much. I heard it was a fall. A lady in the community, she's a gossiper. She's going from house to house telling everyone that he died. She could have it all wrong. I mean, I'm sure he died, but he might not have died the way she said he did.
Well, I'm sorry to hear that. That's crazy. And to think that he was just here and now he's gone.
Chapter 3. After Ettie and Elsa May had eaten an early dinner, there was a knock on their door. I'll see who it is, Ettie said as she pushed herself up from the kitchen table.
I can't imagine who it could be at this time of night.
Ettie opened the door, and Doris Weiberger pushed her way inside. Have you heard what's happened, Ettie? Yeah, Elsa May told me. I've got something to tell you that you might not have heard. You'll be hearing it first from me. What is it? Elsa May stepped out of the kitchen and into their small living room. Doris's eyes flickered around the room until they settled on the couch. She remained silent while she hurried over and sat down. Sit down, and I'll tell you what I heard. I learned it when I was at Levi's house. Ettie and Elsa May sat down, ready to hear what she had to say.
Is it about poor young Thomas?
Elsa May asked. Yeah, I heard that he's been killed, murdered, Doris said. Ettie narrowed her eyes. And how does Levi know that? I was just leaving their house, and I overheard him talking to his doctor about the man at the market who threatened to kill Thomas just hours before his death. Of course, they didn't know that I'd heard. Mind you, I wasn't listening in deliberately. They thought I'd left, and I just happened to overhear them. You see, what happened was I was just about to step off the porch after Levi had closed the front door, and I saw that my laces on my shoes were loose. I didn't want to trip over them and have a nasty fall, so I crouched down and did them up properly. That's when I heard what Levi said. Where was Levi when he found out about this? Well, Levi was collecting his doctor, the younger one from the market. You mean Thea? Elsa May asked. That's the one. Levi always collects Thea from the market every day, and I heard from someone else that there had been an almighty argument between Thomas and a man who has a market stall. So it all ties in nicely. Thomas told Levi that the man said he was going to kill him. So Levi didn't actually witness anyone killing Thomas? Ettie asked. Nay, he wasn't there. But don't you see? Nay, Ettie said. People say things in anger, and if someone said he was going to kill Thomas in front of others, he'd be the one least likely to kill Thomas. That is, if Thomas was indeed killed. And no one's heard that Thomas's death was a murder. Are the police saying that Thomas was killed, Doris? Elsa May asked. Doris's lips turned down at the corners. I haven't heard that. You seem to know everything else, Elsa May shot back. I thought you'd both be interested to know that Thomas Strongberg might have been killed. We are. Dinka for letting us know. You say he fell off a ladder? That's what Elsa May told me. Fell off? Or pushed off? Doris asked. As with most barns, they have a ladder leading to the loft. Their loft was quite high. Ettie frowned while she thought about Doris's murder theory. So this man who argued with him that day, he would have had to hide in the barn, in the loft, knowing that Thomas was going to go up the ladder, and then he pushed the ladder over. And to do that, he would have had to have known where Thomas lived and get there before Thomas did. He was an Englisher, so he probably had a car and could get to Thomas's house faster right after the market closed, Doris said. Elsa May perched her glasses on the end of her nose and then picked up her knitting from the bag by her feet. And he would have had to get into the barn without anyone seeing him and get out without anyone seeing him. Maybe someone saw something. We don't know yet because they still think it was an accident, Doris said. Ettie rubbed her chin. I wonder. What? What is it, Ettie? Doris asked. What did the two men argue about? Why, Thea, of course. Didn't I mention that? Elsa May dropped her knitting into her lap. A love triangle? How intriguing. It's been many years since we had one of those around here. I hardly think it was anything of the kind, Elsa May, Doris said. Elsa May pulled a face and went back to knitting. Darn it, I've dropped a stitch. While Elsa May tried to save the stitch, Doris said, The young man in question is an Englisher. Thea doesn't like him at all. Neither did she like Thomas, I believe. It was nothing like that, Elsa May. Nothing like a love triangle or any other love shape. The point is that both young men liked Thea, and that's how the argument began. Did Thea tell you that? She was there when I was talking with her mother and father. Levi was speaking, and Thea didn't say it wasn't so. I overheard Levi comment something about that to his doctor when I was on the porch. Chapter 4. Thea Hersh opened the door to see an Englisher in a rumpled dark blue suit. Hello?
Good evening. I'm Detective Kelly. Can I come in?
I guess so. Thea opened the door wider, and the detective walked in. Should I get my parents?
Yes, that might be a good idea. I'm here about Thomas Strongberg.
Taya ran upstairs to get her parents. She and her father hadn't been back long from the market, and her mother and father were talking while her father was washing up and changing clothes. Dot, Mom, there's a detective downstairs, here to talk about Thomas.
You let him in the house?
Her father stared at her. Yeah, was that wrong? She could tell her father was furious. How was she to know he didn't want the man in the house? When she walked back downstairs with her parents following, the detective had made himself comfortable on the couch in the living room.
I'm going to have to ask you to leave, Levi said. I'm Detective Kelly, and I'm here about Thomas Strongberg. Were any threats made towards Thomas?
The detective asked Taya. No, just a man at the market who said something in anger about killing him, but he didn't mean it. Thomas was being a bully, and I guessed that Austin was trying to stand up for himself.
How well do you know Austin?
Taya's father stared at her, waiting for her to answer the detective's question. She looked at her father and then said to the detective, I know him well enough to know that he didn't mean what he said. People say things when they get angry that they don't really mean. The detective stared at Levi as though waiting for him to comment. Levi hesitated and then said,
Thomas told me that the man running the honey stall said he was going to kill him. Did Thomas appear to take his threats seriously?
Kelly asked.
I don't mean to be rude, but my daughter shouldn't have let you in the house. I'll have to ask you to leave.
Kelly stood up.
Just one more question, please. Was Thomas worried by the threat? I thought so,
Levi answered gruffly. Detective, do you think someone killed him? Is that why you're asking? Taya asked. Levi strode to the door, opened it, and Kelly took the hint, walking toward it while answering Taya's question.
It's too early to tell at this stage. It's hard for the forensics crew to work out exactly what happened, since his family moved his body immediately.
Is that all? Levi said, at the now opened front door. Detective Kelly nodded.
Yes, I'm sorry to have disturbed you.
Kelly walked out the door, and just as he was about to get into his car, Taya ran outside. Wait! She yelled out. Kelly stepped back from the car, closing the driver's side door.
What is it?
I don't know if this will help. She looked over her shoulder, knowing her father wouldn't like her talking to the detective without him being there. She had to be quick. It might be nothing, but I noticed that Thomas was a different person when he came back from his Rumspringa. He seemed stressed and almost worried.
Rumspringa. That's when you young Amish people leave the community and go wild?
Taya nodded. I guess that's right, for some.
Exactly when did he return from his Rumspringa?
Around 6 months ago. She glanced around to see her father at the front door with his arms folded. I have to go,
Thank you,
the detective said, before he got into his car. Taya hurried back to the house.
What did you say to him?
Levi asked. I was telling him that Thomas had changed since he came back to the community, that's all.
None of that is our concern, Thea. Now go help your mother.
Chapter 5.
I suppose you've heard what's happened.
The detective asked when Ettie opened her front door to see him standing there. You mean about young Thomas? She answered, standing aside to allow him in.
Yes.
Come in.
Yes, we've heard,
Elsa May called out from her favorite chair where she sat knitting.
I suppose you want us to do some asking around for you?
No one in the community talking to you? Ettie asked with amusement in her voice. Detective Kelly sat on one of their wooden chairs, while Ettie sat on the couch opposite.
I've spoken to Thea and her parents. They knew Thomas. Thea was a good friend of his.
So why are you here? Elsa May asked. Eddie's mouth opened wide. Elsa May, that sounds a little rude. Elsa May dropped her knitting into her lap.
I'm sorry, Detective Kelly.
I didn't mean it to sound like that. You're welcome here any time. You don't need a reason to drop by. Are you here because there's a rumor going around that his death wasn't accidental? Eddie asked. Which was it, an accident or a murder? Elsa May looked over the top of her glasses at Detective Kelly.
It's hard to say since things were moved right after he was found. It was hard for the forensic team to determine what happened with any degree of accuracy. We're still waiting on the coroner's report.
I assume you're here because we can help you with something? Elsa May asked.
I'm here, firstly, to learn what you know of the situation, and secondly, to ask you to keep your eyes and ears open.
What do you know so far? Eddie asked, becoming annoyed that Kelly was taking a long time getting to the point.
The cause of death was a blow to the head. Now, whether that was caused by falling from a great height or from a deliberate blow, the coroner is still to determine that.
That's most unfortunate, Elsa May said. Detective Kelly stared at Elsa May.
Do you know anything about Thomas, Mrs. Lutz?
I know that there was talk about his death, that's all, really.
What did you hear?
Wait a minute and I'll finish this row. I don't want to drop any more stitches. When Elsa May finished the row, she placed her knitting in her lap and perched her reading glasses on top of her head, pushing back her prayer cup. All Eddie and I heard was nothing more than idle gossip, something about an argument with a young man at the farmer's market.
Yes, that's the story I've heard. As I told you, I've just come from Levi Hersh's house, and I've spoken to a young lady called Thea. She witnessed the argument between the two young men. Then she told me something interesting.
Elsa May leaned forward. What?
She said that Thomas had not been the same since he came back from his Rumspringa 6 months ago. Now, what do you make of that?
Eddie was the first to speak. It can be a confusing time for young people. Perhaps he wasn't certain where he belonged, in the community or out of it.
Did he ever get baptized, Ettie?
Elsa May asked. No, I don't think he did. At least I never heard anything about it. Elsa May nodded. Kelly tipped his head to one side.
What's the significance of that?
Usually, when people return from Rumspringa, they've made their decision to officially join the community, and they get baptized, which shows their commitment to God. If they're not ready to commit to the Amish way of life, they generally don't come back. Elsa May added,
and if they leave the community after being baptized, they'll be shunned. Ah, I see. I've heard about shunning. I thought that all Amish were born into it.
No, we aren't born into it like we're a race of people. Our children are raised in the Amish way of life, but one day, when they are old enough, they must each make their own decision. It's a personal decision that every Amish person must make when they're old enough to understand, Elsa May explained.
I'm with you now.
Elsa May said, I hope so. I know what I mean, but I'm having trouble trying to say it in words.
I do know what you mean, Elsa May. Back to Thomas. You're saying you think he was undecided?
Ettie nodded. It seems so, but maybe he was soon to be baptized. The bishop would know, or perhaps Thomas's family would know. Kelly chuckled.
That's where you two come into the picture.
What do you want us to do?
Could you ask around for me? It might come to nothing, but it would be useful to know where Thomas's head was at.
Elsa May and Ettie stared at each other. We'll let you know if we hear of anything. Elsa May said as she picked up her knitting. Detective Kelly drew his eyebrows together.
That's not what I asked.
He looked at Ettie, who looked away.
What's going on with the two of you? Do you know something that you're not letting on?
No, we'll ask some questions, Ettie said. He looked suspiciously from one sister to the other.
Am I missing something here?
Ettie's concerned that people think we talk to the police too much.
I'm a detective.
He laughed and then stopped when he noticed that he was the only one laughing.
You see, that's slightly different from the police.
When neither of them commented, he asked,
You're not going to help me?
He looked again at each sister in turn.
I see. You only help me when an Amish person, someone from your community, is threatened or accused of a crime. Now that no one is in jail, you aren't so keen to help me?
Ettie pursed her lips. What he said was true, but it made them sound selfish and only concerned with their own community rather than the broader community. We'll give it some thought.
I'm not asking too much. The thing is, I know you two will hear things, so all I'm asking is to tell me what you hear. Is that too much to ask?
Ettie looked at Elsa May, hoping she'd speak.
No, we'll do it,
Elsa May said, glancing up from her knitting. It should be, yes, we'll do it. Ettie took every opportunity to correct her older sister, because Elsa May corrected her every day. Elsa May's expression soured. I'm saying no because the detective said, is that too much to ask? I'm merely saying no, it isn't too much to ask. Okay, don't go on about it. Ettie was annoyed that Elsa May always had an answer for everything. Elsa May shook her head. I can't say anything right these days. Ettie chuckled. I'm just getting a bit of my own back, giving you a taste of your own medicine.
Now, have you run out of coffee or what's going on?
Kelly asked, smiling at Ettie's last remark. Ettie pushed herself up from the couch. I'll get you a cup. We've only just boiled the pot, so it won't take long. While Ettie was in the kitchen, she thought about it and decided it was best to help Kelly. Elsa May had been right to agree to do so. Thomas was dead, so it was too late to help him. But if they helped Detective Kelly now, next time someone in the community might be in trouble, he would return the favor. Chapter 6. Kelly hadn't been gone long when Thea knocked on Ettie and Elsa May's door. Thea, what a nice surprise. Come inside. Ettie stepped back and opened the door, moving aside. Denka, Thea walked in and spotted Elsa May. Hello, Mrs. Lutz.
Hello, Thea.
Have you heard about Thomas? We have. Ettie guided Thea to the couch and sat down next to her. I thought if anyone would know anything, it might be you, Mrs. Smith. Ettie frowned, narrowing her eyes. Know what, exactly? Some people think that Thomas might have been murdered. He was a friend of mine, and I just wanted to see what both of you thought. At first, I heard he died accidentally from falling off a ladder, and then someone thought that it might not have been an accident.
Do you know who found Thomas?
Elsa May asked, pushing her knitting back into the bag by her feet. It was one of his brothers, Roy.
Roy? He doesn't live at home still, does he, now that he's married?
Nay, he doesn't. He lives close by. He was visiting, and no one was in the house, and he went into the barn to see if anyone was there. That's when he found Thomas lying on the barn floor. Elsa May reached back into her bag and pulled out her knitting again as she said,
Now, Thea, the world is not about to end. A nice cup of tea always helps one to see things clearly and think things through. If there is a problem, then there's surely a solution.
This is just the way the world works. Taya nodded. Okay, I guess I've gotten myself a bit worked up over the whole thing. A cup of tea would be nice.
Ettie!
Yeah, I'd like one too. Danke, Elsa May. Elsa May's brow furrowed more deeply.
I meant you can please get it for us, Ettie.
Ah, Ettie pushed herself up. She would have much preferred to sit talking to Taya, and besides, they'd just finished a cup with Detective Kelly. How do you have it, Taya? I like it white with one, danke. Ettie walked to the kitchen, listening to Elsa May talk to Taya, while also thinking of her own questions to ask Taya when she returned. Taya felt a little brighter talking to Elsa May. She was a kind woman who seemed to care about her problems. Here you are, Taya, white with one. Thank you, Mrs. Smith. Taya took the cup and saucer with both hands.
What about me?
Elsa May asked her sister. Ettie held up both her hands. How many can you count? I've only got the two. Ettie shook her head at her sister. Ours are in the kitchen. I can only carry one at a time.
You normally bring everything out on a tray.
Elsa May made a gruff sound from the back of her throat, while Ettie hurried to the kitchen. Taya did her best to contain a smile. Once they all had their tea, Ettie asked Taya, Have I missed anything? What did you two talk about while I was in the kitchen? Nay, nothing. We waited for you. I first heard that Thomas fell off a ladder. Is that what you heard? Taya asked them. That's what we heard, but what we hear and the truth are often two very different things, Ettie said. We also heard a rumor of Thomas arguing with the man, and then that man had threatened him. That's almost true. That was someone I know at the market, but he didn't mean he would actually kill him. It wasn't said like that at all. Thomas had developed a bad temper, and he pushed over a stallholder's honey display and smashed a bottle, and that made the stallholder angry. I worry that Thomas might have made some enemies out of some Englishers. What was the stallholder's name? His name is Austin. I don't know his last name. He's fairly new at the market and sells organic honey. I guess he's got hives, too, somewhere. I think he said once that he leases some land somewhere near someone's orchard.
Organic honey? That's a new one to me. Exactly what does it take for honey to be called organic? Elsa May asked.
He told me once. There can be no pesticides used on any land within so many miles of where the beehives are kept. Ah, that sounds like a good idea, Ettie said.
Did Thomas have any enemies that you knew of personally, or by name?
Elsa May asked, leaning forward to take a piece of cake from the plate Ettie had brought in after she'd delivered their tea. Nay, he wasn't very nice to a lot of people. People outside of the community might not be so forgiving with the way he'd become. Are you talking specifically about Austin? Taya shook her head. Nay, I'm not. I don't know how that rumor got around so quickly. We've heard it from a couple of people now, Ettie said. Oh dear, poor Austin. He didn't mean it. They got into an argument, him and Thomas. It was Thomas's fault. I've always been good at knowing what people are like, and Austin is a gentle person. He wouldn't do anything to harm anybody. That's what I think he's like anyway. Elsa May chuckled.
Quite fond of him, are you?
I do like him, but not like that. Not in a romantic way. He's just a friend. Oh, please don't say anything to my father. He's already so overprotective. He was there just after the argument. Thomas told him about it, and he would have made it sound 10 times worse.
I won't say anything. We had a father like that ourselves once. I was married with 6 kinner before he stopped being overprotective. It's a wonder he allowed me to marry at all.
Ettie laughed at Elsa May's story. Yeah, I remember feeling the same way, like he'd always see me as a little girl. I hope it doesn't take that long before Dot stops watching me. Taya gave a little laugh and then stopped abruptly and frowned. I'm a little worried. What if Austin gets blamed for Thomas's murder? Elsa May shook her head. That shouldn't happen. But things like that do happen. My friend Bessie said that he might get blamed. Police have scientific ways of finding out who committed crimes in these modern days. I know that, Mrs. Lutz, but the detective who came to the house asking questions said they weren't even sure how he died because Thomas was moved after he died. Who moved him? I don't know. He just said the family moved him. So he might mean his brother, because that's who found him. I'm not sure. Try not to worry, Taya. You're much too young to have those worry lines in your forehead, Elsa May said. Another line or two on my face wouldn't matter, but you're far too young to have lines. Although I do think you're old enough to do away with the Mrs. thing and call us Elsa May and Ettie. Taya smiled and nodded, and then sipped from her teacup. It was good to be with the elderly sisters. Everything was calm in their house. Even the fluffy white dog curled up asleep in the corner of the room looked peaceful. The sisters made her feel that everything would turn out okay. She leaned back into the couch, clutching her teacup, and hoping it would be so. Chapter 7. The next day, Ettie and Elsa May went to visit the Strongbergs, Thomas's parents. The funeral was still a few days away, until relations who lived in different communities had time to get there. When they knocked on their door with a chicken casserole in Ettie's hands, the door was opened by Thomas's younger sister, who called out to her parents, invited the sisters into the living room, and then disappeared into the kitchen with the casserole. The gurgle of the water heating on the stove soon filtered into the living room. Soon they were joined by Thomas's parents, Wilma and Samuel. After getting through the mandatory pleasantries and some uncomfortable pauses, Elsa May asked, "How are both of you coping?" "We know where he is, so that gives us some comfort," Wilma said. "So he got baptized?" Ettie asked, knowing that if he hadn't been baptized, they would be uncertain about his place in the hereafter. Wilma gasped. Samuel put a hand on Wilma's shoulder. "He was baptized shortly after he came back to us." Their daughter sat down with them. "Mrs. Lutz and Mrs. Smith brought us a chicken casserole." "How kind, Dinka. Becky, would you make us some tea?" "Yeah, I've just put the pot on the stove." When Becky went out of the room again, Wilma said, "We don't know what happened to him, and that's a horrible thing. We don't know if someone took his life or whether he just fell." Samuel said, "He's gone, and that's all that should matter." "Nay, if someone killed him, someone else might get killed too," Wilma said. "And if he was killed, why would someone do that?" "Surely there would be no reason for him to be killed?" Ettie asked. "There's no reason," Samuel said. "He more than likely fell. Roy said that the ladder was across his body as he lay there. It's more than likely he fell, even though it seems hard to work out why he would have fallen and how the fall would have killed him." "I heard that Roy moved him, or that someone did after he died. Do you know why?" Samuel nodded. "Roy tried to revive him, but to no avail. He was gone. Wilma and I arrived home, and Roy came out of the barn to tell us what had happened. We didn't want him to lie there in the barn alone, so we moved him into the house. The police weren't too happy about that when they arrived." "Who called the police?" "They came automatically when we called the funeral director, and so did the paramedics." Wilma shook her head. "We have no experience in these things. We didn't know the proper things to do. How would we know we weren't supposed to touch anything? It was the last thing on our minds that someone might have killed our son. Samuel said,
He was one fine young man. He never ever fainted or felt dizzy or anything like that. He was healthy and he steered clear of booze. And he's been up there hundreds of times to that loft, if not thousands of times. I can't think who'd have reason to want him dead. But neither am I convinced he fell.
"We've gone over it and over it a million times, and we can't work it out," Wilma said. "I understand. It is all very peculiar. Sorry for asking silly questions, burdening you over your loss," Ettie said. "The police have been here and detectives. I think they feel there's more to things than Thomas falling," Wilma said.
Well, whatever happened, whoever did what, my son died. And whoever had a hand in that will have to face his maker one day and give an account.
Samuel clenched his jaw, and Ettie knew he was doing his best to stop the tears that were forming in his eyes. Wilma touched his arm gently.
I suppose you've heard rumors that there was an argument at the farmer's market involving Thomas? Elsa May asked.
"Yeah, we heard," Wilma said. "I think that's what got everyone thinking there's more to this than Thomas falling." "Could he have met some people on his Rumspringa who might have disagreed with him over something?" Ettie asked.
He was aware of who to spend time with and who to avoid. He didn't go to the clubs, pubs, or the like. He was bored by that stuff. He was not that into baseball or other sports either. So he never got into fights, really. He preferred working in the orchard, waking up early, going to the market, taking care of the livestock, and he recently started his roofing business. Look, if we had any idea, we would tell you, just like we would have told the police.
"How about love?" asked Elsa May with a faint smile.
Love?
"Yeah, love. Did he have any love interests?"
Well, we know he liked Thea, but it was far from a relationship.
"They say he had an argument with the boy from the market over Thea," Ettie said.
Roy heard the men argue at the market.
Samuel said. "They both probably were fond of young Thea," Wilma said in a soft voice, suddenly joining the conversation. "I know Thomas was fond of her." Elsa May carefully continued.
Well, love is a battlefield, says one of the Englishers' songs, or so I'm told.
It suddenly clicked with Ettie that Samuel said something odd. "Roy was there at the market, too?"
Yeah, that's right. But he described it as boys bickering. One jealous guy was barking at another. Besides,
Samuel hesitated.
besides,
Asked Elsa May quizzically after the pause got longish.
besides, my son was a big man. He wouldn't have been easy to overpower.
Ettie wanted to point out that if his son had been hit over the head, Thomas's height or physical strength wouldn't have mattered, but good sense told her to keep silent. The picture in her mind was too grisly. It seemed Thomas's parents knew nothing. But Roy seemed always to be about. He was there at the market, and he also found the body. "How is Roy?" Ettie asked.
He's upset, naturally. It was awful for him finding Thomas like he did.
"That day, did Thomas go home with Roy? Did they travel back here together?" Samuel shook his head.
You'd have to ask Roy that. We don't know how Thomas got home, or how Roy came to be here at that moment.
Ettie gave Elsa May a sideways glance, and knew they were thinking the same thing. Their next stop had to be a talk with Roy. Was it merely a coincidence that he witnessed the argument and then found his brother's body as well? While riding back to their house in a taxi, Ettie said, "They didn't know anything."
Nay, we'll have to find Roy.
"Shall we wait until the funeral?"
I think that's the best idea. We don't want to make a special trip to his house, since we've never visited him before now.
Ettie blew out a deep breath.
Are you okay?
Ettie whispered so that the taxi driver wouldn't overhear. "Yeah, fine. I'll feel better once we find out what the police think about why he died."
Elsa May whispered back. The coroner will make his report soon.
"And until then, we perhaps shouldn't ask too many questions."
Elsa May nodded. I think you're right for once, Ettie.
Ettie turned and stared at her sister, thinking perhaps she was joking. But her eyes remained looking to the front, and her face was deadpan. Chapter 8. At the market the next day, Thea was concerned about the mounting rumors surrounding Austin. And then she was even more concerned when he hadn't shown up for work an hour and more past his usual opening time. When her father came to collect her from work at the end of the day, she told him she wanted to visit friends and would come home later. Thankfully, he nodded and asked no questions. Taya had found out from someone at the market where Austin lived, and soon after she stood at the front door of his apartment and rang the doorbell. Her boot tapped nervously on the mat outside the door. She bit her lip and suddenly hoped he wouldn't answer, and then a second later she prayed that he would. The door opened just a crack, and she could see part of Austin's face. "Come in," he murmured after a while, leaving the door open and withdrawing into the dark behind him. Taya cautiously tiptoed inside and was overwhelmed by the odor of stale beer. She stepped over the clumps of things lying everywhere and followed him to the couch where she sat down. He lit a cigarette and took up the controller of a game console and continued with his game. After a while, he spoke. "If you want anything, go take it. There's beer in the fridge. And OJ." "I'm okay." Taya sat silently for a few minutes, watching his game as Austin made his way through waves of space monsters jumping out from behind trees in a colorful forest. He suddenly stopped and turned off the game and stared at her.
Why are you here, Taya? I hope your dad didn't follow you here, or I'll be in all kinds of trouble. More trouble than I'm probably already in."
"I'm worried about you, that's all."
"Why? Is it because everyone thinks I caused Thomas's death? I hope the coppers don't think I did it, because that good-for-nothing lunatic chose that very moment, minutes after our argument, to freaking walk off from the roof of his barn so skillfully that he was able to kill himself from a 12-foot fall."
He wasn't making much sense at all, and his speech was slurred. "Why weren't you at work today?"
Why? Because if I'm going to be arrested, I don't want it to happen where so many people can see it.
Austin jumped off his threadbare couch and stormed into the kitchen. Taya pulled her legs up and hugged them. A tear trickled silently down her face, and she heard the hiss of a beer bottle opening. He lurched back, putting a beer bottle under Taya's nose without asking anything, and slammed back into the couch, hugging his bottle. He took up his cigarette packet, shook out another cigarette, and lit it. Taya wasn't fond of beer, and left the one that he'd meant for her sitting in front of her. He drew in the smoke and slowly exhaled.
What was his problem anyway?
She knew he was referring to Thomas. I don't know. He wasn't always like that. Something seemed to be eating away at him lately.
He was horrible.
He wasn't. You didn't know Thomas like I did.
Do you believe that he died accidentally?
Yes, I guess so. There's no reason to believe otherwise. I don't think you did it, if that's what you're asking. He scoffed and tapped the ash of his cigarette into the top of one of the several empty beer bottles on the coffee table.
That's a relief. How did the rumor get around that I had anything to do with it?
I think because people at the market heard the argument you had with him just before he died.
I figured that. Coppers listen to things like that. That's why I just hung out here today. I could be facing life or the electric chair because of that idiot,
He said in a hoarse tone.
I could see the way people were looking at me yesterday. I didn't want to go through that again today.
You're not going to jail. You're innocent, and they don't have anything against you. So you can just get yourself together and quit whining. She stood up. There was no use staying. He looked like he'd been drinking all day, and he probably wouldn't even remember she'd come there. Austin screwed up his face as he looked up at her.
Are you going now? You just got here.
Yes. She walked toward the door. He staggered to his feet.
Thanks for coming, Thea. You're a real friend, and I never had many of those.
Turning around, she said, "Can I get you anything, Austin? Maybe some food?"
He leaned over and picked up his beer bottle. I've got this.
She frowned at him and couldn't just leave him like that. "I'll see what you've got in the fridge."
No, I couldn't eat anything anyway. Just go home. I'll be okay tomorrow.
Will you?
Yeah, I'll snap out of it. If they want to arrest me, then let 'em do it.
Go easy on the beer, would you?
He smiled. I don't have any more left after these, so I've got no choice.
Good. I'll see you tomorrow.
Bye, Thea.
Taya left his apartment feeling satisfied that she'd checked on him. He wasn't in a good way, though, and she couldn't blame him. Chapter 9. Ettie and Elsa May traveled to the funeral with Elsa May's grandson, Jeremiah, and his wife, Ava. The first part of the funeral would be the viewing of the body at Thomas's parents' house, and then the body would be taken to the grave, followed by a long procession of buggies. "We've heard that it might not have been an accident," Ava said as she turned around and spoke to the elderly sisters who were in the back seat of the buggy.
Ava, there's no need to say things like that,
Jeremiah cautioned her. "It's only Elsa May and Ettie. They don't mind. They usually know what's happening around the community. It's not as though I'm spreading rumors."
Okay, Jeremiah agreed. I guess that's true.
Ava turned back to the sisters. "Well?"
Detective Kelly is on the case. He's waiting to hear back about the coroner's findings. There seems to be some delay.
"Unless he knows already and he's not telling us," Ettie said to her sister.
Either way, he thinks that there's some doubt about it being an accidental death.
"They say Roy found him," Ava said.
Yeah, he found him, and he also witnessed the argument at the market, Elsa May said.
Ettie added, "The one that fueled the rumors about it being a murder rather than an accidental death."
Sure sounds like gossip to me, Jeremiah said. It's sharing of information, Elsa May told her grandson.
"Yeah, Jeremiah. Detective Kelly asked for our help in keeping our ears open to help him with clues," Ettie said. "And he's helped us before, so we are repaying his kindness." Jeremiah raised one hand while holding the reins in the other.
Okay, I'm clearly outnumbered here, so I'll keep my mouth shut.
Ava giggled at what her husband said and then turned around to the sisters. "Let me know if you need any help."
We will, Elsa May said. We're hoping to talk with Roy today if we can get him alone. Why don't you leave it for today? It's his brother's funeral, Jeremiah said. I thought you were keeping your mouth shut, grandson, Elsa May asked.
Jeremiah, if it were up to you, we'd never talk with Roy about what happened, Ettie added. We're only trying to help. We're not being destructive.
I'll try to keep out of it, Jeremiah said.
Minutes later, Jeremiah stopped his buggy at the end of a long row of buggies at the Strongberg home. There was a crowd just inside the house when Ettie and Elsa May made their way through the front door with Ava close behind them. In front of them was the coffin with Mrs. Wilma Strongberg beside it. It was a sight that saddened Ettie. The woman would never have expected to lose a son so suddenly, accident or otherwise. People milled past the coffin, paying their respects, and then saying a few words to the rest of the family who were on the right side of the room. Ettie, Elsa May, and Ava followed the general direction of the crowd. It was Ettie's habit not to look at the dead, as she'd rather remember people as they'd been. Once they got to Mrs. Strongberg, Elsa May was the spokesperson for the three of them. After her kind words, they gravitated to converse with the rest of the Strongberg family. When Roy, Thomas's older brother, broke away from the group to go outside, Ettie and Elsa May were quick to follow him.
Roy.
Roy turned around and looked at Elsa May.
Yeah?
Ettie and I are concerned about something.
What is it? Do you need a ride to the graveside?
Nay, Dinka. Jeremiah has kindly offered to drive us. It's about Thomas.
What about him?
We know he was troubled about something. Do you know what it was? Roy lowered his eyes and rubbed his dark beard. When he looked up, he said,
He told you something was troubling him?
Not us ourselves, but we think he was upset about something.
The day he died, he was going to tell me something. I got the idea he might have been in trouble. It was something to do with a friend he made on Rumspringa.
Did he ever say what it was?
Or who the friend was? Elsa May added. He was about to tell me that day. He said he couldn't keep it in any longer. He came to see me, and then Olive wanted to go to the market, and I ended up going instead. He came along, and when we were there, Thomas said he would go say hello to Thea. When I took him home, we talked along the way, and he said he wanted to tell me what was going on in his life. I knew Olive needed the meat for our dinner that night, so I took him home and said I'd be right back to hear what it was.
Why didn't he go with you? Ettie asked. Roy stared at Ettie a while before he answered.
I don't know. He didn't ask, and I guess I didn't offer. I was in a rush to get the meat home to Olive. I knew she'd be waiting for it.
Then what happened? Elsa May asked.
When I got back, he wasn't in the house. I thought he might be in the barn, and then I found him as soon as I walked in.
Was there anything out of place?
I didn't look, but ever since Thomas had come back from Rumspringa, the barn was left in a mess with stuff everywhere. Anyway, the ladder was across him, so I pushed it away and saw he wasn't breathing. I did my best to revive him, and nothing I did worked. I heard a buggy and rushed out to see Mom and Dot had just arrived home. I hollered out to them and told them what had happened. They rushed in and saw him. It was too late. He'd gone.
He was already dead when you found him, though? Elsa May asked.
Yeah. So Dot and I carried him into the house, and we called the funeral director. We didn't know what else to do.
Did you see any sign of anyone else there? A car leaving or anything like that?
Nay, I passed no car on the way. Not near the house. I would have remembered if I had.
Who called the police? Ettie asked.
It must have been the funeral director who called the paramedics and the police, because they actually arrived first. It seems the police think it wasn't an accident and they're suspicious that he was moved.
You weren't to know, Ettie said.
How would I? Roy commented. Anyway, he's gone now, and I was too late to help him. Tears came to his eyes. I was his older brother, and I should have been able to protect him. That was my job as an older brother, and I failed him.
It might have been an accident, though, and if it were, we know that it was God's will.
Roy blinked a couple of times. It was a shock to see him there. I never even thought that one of my siblings would die so young. Roy managed to smile before he hurried away.
I feel awful asking him questions like that right now, Ettie said.
I know, me too, but it's best to ask before he forgets anything.
I suppose, but today is the funeral.
Ettie, you're starting to sound like Jeremiah.
Ettie nibbled on a fingernail. I just wish we knew what really happened.
We will. I hope.
Chapter 10. That night, Detective Kelly came to Elsa May and Ettie's house.
I've got some interesting information,
he announced at the door. Once Kelly was seated in front of them, he began.
The coroner has delivered his findings. From the angle Thomas Strongberg was hit, it could either have been a blow to the head or a fall, although he's judging it as inconclusive.
Well, that's not really helping me at all, Ettie said.
Surely a blow to the head would have done more damage than a fall, Elsa May asked. I'm no expert, I just go on what I'm told. What do you do now, Detective? Do you look for a killer or not? Elsa May asked. You're right, it's very difficult. All we can do is ask questions and investigate further, and then if nothing turns up, we'll have to wrap up the case. With the findings being inconclusive, we've got no other choice. So it's likely that a murderer might get away with it if Thomas was killed, and you can't do anything about proving it? That's right. We'll just have to close the case and put it down to an accident.
But we don't even know it was a fall for certain.
According to the brother, he found the ladder across his brother's body, and that's all we've got to go on. There was no one else there at the time.
Why isn't anything ever simple? Elsa May asked.
It gets more intriguing, Elsa May.
Elsa May leaned forward with her eyebrows nearly reaching her starched white prayer cap. The detective continued.
Thomas Strongberg was arrested during his Rumspringa, and that was 1 year ago.
Elsa May dropped her knitting and her mouth fell open in shock. What were the charges? Ettie asked.
Drug charges. He was mixed up with a group of people who were selling and smuggling drugs.
Smuggling them to where? Ettie asked.
Into the country.
What happened? Elsa May asked.
The charges were eventually dropped. The person he was arrested with claimed that Thomas had nothing to do with it. He was just at the wrong place at the wrong time. We had no evidence to make anything stick, so the charges were dropped.
With whom was he arrested? Asked Elsa May.
A man by the name of Bart Crittenden. He's serving time now, but he's due for parole soon.
Ettie breathed out heavily.
That's not good,
Elsa May said. The detective continued.
Thomas was keeping bad company. But I suppose I shouldn't speak ill of the dead.
Ettie scratched the side of her face while she thought for a moment. Detective Kelly and Elsa May stared at her.
What are you thinking, Ettie? Elsa May asked.
It ties in with what Thea said. She said that he wasn't the same when he came back from his Rumspringa. Perhaps he had been on drugs and that had changed his personality. I've heard of that happening.
You've been talking with Thea Hersh? The detective asked.
Yes, she came to see us just after you left, the last time you were here.
Well, that would have been nice to know.
We're telling you now. This is the first chance we've had.
Elsa May added. She told us she told you the very same thing. He wasn't himself after Rumspringa, unless she was speaking to another detective. No, it was I, he grumbled. I'll let you off the hook this time. Elsa May put her hand on her chest. I'm glad we got out of that one so easily.
And is this man, is he still in jail?
Ettie asked. He's due for parole soon, but he's in jail right now, yes. I wouldn't read too much into things, Ettie. It might be something to go on, or it might not. Many young men get involved in things they shouldn't when they're young, and then they set themselves on the right path. I remember I did the odd bad thing myself once or twice when I was a youngster. The detective chuckled. Elsa May shook her head. I find that very hard to believe. It's true. My friends and I used to hide with a bunch of raw eggs and throw them at passing cars. More times than not, the driver would get out and chase us. Kelly laughed again. They never caught us. Luckily, we could outrun them. That sounds like a dreadful thing to do. How old were you when you did that? I don't remember exactly. Let's just say I was a young teenager. Elsa May shook her head while making tisk tisk sounds with her tongue.
So you think it had nothing to do with anyone Thomas was involved with?
Ettie asked. All I can do at this time is to keep an open mind and keep asking questions and see what else happens. Now, if you like a good story, Bart Crittenden appears to have gotten away with $20,000.
What do you mean? Asked Ettie.
We were following a trail of money laundering, and we traced the money to Bart. That's how we originally came across Bart. It wasn't originally the drugs, it was the money laundering racket. Anyway, when we busted him, he was supposed to have the 20 grand on him, and he had nothing. He claims to know nothing about the money.
So it's out there somewhere?
Elsa May asked. Kelly nodded. He's got a nice little nest egg stashed away for when he gets out. Kelly looked over at Ettie. Do you know what money laundering is?
Ettie nodded and hoped he didn't ask her what she thought it meant. She had a bit of an idea, but she'd ask Elsa May when the detective left. There was another knock on the door, and Ettie was pleased with the interruption. We're popular tonight, aren't we? Ettie pushed herself up to answer the door. Ava stood before her on the doorstep. Ettie, why did you and Elsa May leave the funeral so quickly? You and Jeremiah look like you wanted to stay on, and we don't have the stamina we once had. Ava walked through the door and then stopped suddenly when she saw the detective. The detective turned his head to look at her. Ava, hello. Hello, Detective. Ava sat down on one of the wooden chairs next to Detective Kelly. Did you hear something else at the funeral? Is that why you're here? Elsa May asked. Yes, that's why I'm here, to tell you about it. Even Jeremiah thought I should come here and let you know. Well, it must be something important if even Jeremiah thought you should come here, Ettie said. Ava glanced sideways at Kelly. I don't know if this is something you know, too, but I heard that Thomas had won a contract over an Englisher called William Spreed, and I've heard that some people were angry over it. What kind of a contract? I didn't get that far. Some kind of business contract, I'd assume. I don't even know what kind of business Thomas was in. Is that all you know? Elsa May asked. Ava shook her head. There are half a dozen stories that were flying around at the end of the funeral. There was another one that Thomas had an Englisher girlfriend as well, and she wouldn't believe it was over, and she kept trying to win him back. She'd been following him and everything. We call those kinds of people stalkers. They can be dangerous, Kelly said. Ettie straightened herself up and started taking notice when the detective appeared interested in what Ava had to say. The detective turned toward Ava.
What else did you find out? Did you get the girl's name?
Her name is Brianna Taylor. I'm sure it was that. The detective wasted no time reaching into his pocket to pull out his notebook and pen.
Brianna Taylor, he repeated as he wrote the name down. Good work, Ava. And the other name was William Spreed?
Yes, that's right. Detective Kelly chuckled.
I should have just come straight to you, Ava.
Ava gasped, and her hands flew to her throat. Oh no, that would be the last thing Jeremiah would want.
I'm only joking, he said. The last thing I want is to upset anyone.
When the detective left, Ava leaned over and whispered to the two sisters. I think that they were both possibly at the funeral. That's why there was talk about them.
Who were there?
Elsa May asked. That William Spreed man and the girl, Brianna Taylor.
I saw a couple of Englishers standing around.
I didn't stop to think anything of it, Elsa May said. Why did you keep that from the detective, Ava? Ettie asked. I don't know. I thought we shouldn't tell him everything. It's not as if it really mattered, did it? Ettie pushed out her lips. He's going to look into them anyway. In my book, being at his funeral makes them look like they had more than a passing interest in Thomas's life.
Shall we attempt to find out what we can about each of those people?
Elsa May asked Ettie. I could go and look them up tomorrow on the computer in the library. I have to do some work for my mother in the afternoon, but I could collect both of you in the morning and we could all go.
Dinka, Ava, why don't we do that?
Sounds like a good plan, Ettie agreed. Would you like a cup of tea, Ava? Ava stood up. Nay, Dinka. I told Jeremiah I wouldn't be away long. Chapter 11. After all the rumors flying around at Thomas's funeral, Thea wasn't going to sit back and let her new friend, Austin, be blamed for something he didn't do. As soon as it was dark, she went to her bedroom early and then sneaked out of the house. She took a flashlight and called a taxi from the barn and had it pick her up from her nearest crossroad in 10 minutes' time. She ran from the house in the dark to reach the taxi in time. She had the taxi driver take her to Austin's apartment, hoping he'd agree with her plan. After the taxi pulled up outside the apartment block, she paid the driver, and then she walked toward his ground-floor apartment with her heart pumping wildly. Through the window, she could see the flickering lights of what she thought was a video game. After she had taken a deep breath to steady her nerves, she knocked on the door. He opened it just a crack and peeked out. When he recognized her, he opened the door.
Thea.
Yeah, it's me.
What are you doing here so late?
Can I come in?
Yeah.
Once she was inside, she wasted no time. I thought we should do something about the rumors surrounding you and Thomas. He huffed. Yeah,
Like what?
his eyes dropped to the flashlight in her hand. I think we should look for clues in his barn.
You can't be serious, Thea.
I am. We'll wait until everyone's asleep and no one will know that we've ever been there.
What are you hoping to find? The police would have been all over the place.
Maybe they missed something. He stared at her as though she were crazy.
Like?
I don't know. We'll know it when we find it. He shook his head.
Thanks for caring, but it won't do any good. Besides, if we're caught, we'll be arrested for trespassing. Or they might think I'm guilty and coming back to the scene of the crime. I've seen things like this on TV, where things go wrong because of people poking around.
Okay, I'll go by myself then.
Thea turned on her heel, and Austin grabbed her arm. Don't. It's silly.
It is not. I thought you'd want to come with me, but I'll go by myself. She opened the door, and once she was through, she slammed the door and ran into the night. On hearing his door click open, she turned around.
Wait. I'll come.
She was relieved. She secretly didn't know whether she would have gone to the dark barn by herself. Now, with Austin there, it would give her courage. She waited for Austin to catch up with her.
I think you're mad. We can take my car.
He clicked a remote and the lights of a nearby car lit up. Good. We can park it up the road and then we'll have to walk a fair way to the house so they don't see the car's headlights. Thea didn't even dare to think what her father would say if he knew she was in an Englisher's car. They drove the 10 minutes it took to get to Thomas's house and parked the car up the road as Thea had suggested.
If only the night wasn't so cloudy, Austin said as soon as he got out of his car.
It's not too bad. We can't put a flashlight on here, or someone might see us, Thea said. We'll have to wait until we get to the barn. Together, they made their way closer.
Remind me why we're doing this, Austin whispered.
I've got a hunch, that's all.
You know something, don't you? Do you know who killed him, and you want to hide the evidence?
No, it's nothing like that. Of course I don't know who killed him.
What's the hunch about?
I don't know. Maybe I don't have a hunch. Maybe I'm just curious to see if I can work out if it's possible to die from falling out of the loft or off the ladder. They weren't sure what happened, and I just want to see for myself.
Why don't you go and ask his parents? You know them, don't you?
Ask them to have a look in their barn, you mean?
Yeah.
I wouldn't like to do that,
Austin said. It's possible to die from falling off a chair if you fall the wrong way on your neck.
Yeah, but it's unlikely. I just feel that something's not right.
I hope this isn't going to be a waste of time.
Are you sad that you're missing out on your video games? Thea asked with laughter in her voice.
Don't knock it till you try it.
I've no interest in games. Games are for children and a total waste of time for adults. Now don't talk. We're getting too close. They might hear us. To get to the barn, Thea and Austin had to walk past the house. They stayed in the dark of the shadows the best they could. The only light around was the soft glow coming from an upstairs window of the house. When they reached the barn, the door was slightly open and Thea went first, pushing her weight against the tall, rough wooden doors. She covered her nose when she breathed in a weird smell like sour grain. "Come on, Austin," she whispered. "Stay close behind. We've only got the one light."
I'm right behind you. Should I turn the flashlight on now?
No, wait until we're further inside. You go first. I can't see where I'm going. Austin took hold of Thea's shoulders, made his way past her, and then he grabbed hold of her hand.
Stay close, he said.
The next thing Thea knew, Austin pulled her to the ground with a thud. She sneezed when a cloud of dust invaded her nostrils. "What are you doing?" she hissed as she straightened her prayer cup.
Shh! I fell over something.
Austin stood up and pulled Thea to her feet. "What is it?"
Dunno. I'm going to put the flashlight on.
"No, not yet. Go around it," Thea ordered.
It could be a sack of grain. Here."
He put the flashlight into her hand.
Turn the light on now, Thea.
"Okay, and then I want to get close to the loft." Before Thea could turn on the flashlight, the barn doors behind them flew open, and beams from a huge hurricane light lit up the barn. Thea and Austin stood squinting into the light at the large man walking toward them.
Is that you, Thea?
It was Mr. Strongberg's voice. "Yeah?"
What are you doing?
He walked closer, and then Mr. Strongberg stopped in his tracks as he looked beyond them on the barn floor.
What have you done?
Thea's eyes followed Mr. Strongberg's gaze. It was a body. When she realized that what they'd fallen over was the lifeless body of a man, she screamed and dropped her flashlight, running to the door. Austin, frightened by her screams, jumped a few steps sideways and looked back to see what had terrified her. "It's a body!" Thea screamed again. Austin's mouth dropped open as he stared at the corpse. He turned to Thea and pointed to her clothes.
Look.
She looked down to see smudges of blood down the front of her dress and apron. Then she looked at Austin. And look at you. Austin looked down to see blood down the front of his sweatshirt. Mr. Strongberg handed Thea his light.
What have you done? Have you killed him? Hold the light, and I'll see if he's still alive.
We didn't do anything. We didn't even know. We only came. Thea stammered and couldn't speak.
Hold the light still.
Mr. Strongberg's voice boomed as he leaned over the body. Seconds later, he straightened up.
He's dead. I'll have to call the police.
We should go now, Thea, Austin said, backing away.
No, both of you stay here. They'll want to talk to you.
Mr. Strongberg took the light from Thea and stomped further into the barn. Austin and Thea stayed near the open door of the barn, staring at each other in silence. When Mr. Strongberg came back, he asked,
What's the man's name?
Austin looked at the ground.
I don't know.
We don't know him, Thea said. We didn't know he was here.
I have to talk to them again. Both of you stay here. Don't go anywhere.
Thea knew she was in terrible trouble and felt much worse for having dragged Austin into trouble with her. It had been a dumb idea to look in the barn, especially when she had no real idea what she was looking for. A dead body was not what she'd had in mind. Chapter 12. Ettie and Elsa May had just gotten into Ava's buggy when Doris Weiberger pulled up in her buggy. Ettie stepped out to talk with her. Doris, what's wrong? You look very distressed. I am. There's been someone else found dead at the Strongberg place. Elsa May stuck her head out of the buggy. Who? I heard it was some Englisher, and that's all I know. And do you want to know something else? Yeah, what? Ettie peered at her. He was killed in the barn, too, and they have 2 people who did it. Ava stepped out of the buggy. How did you hear all this, Doris? I heard it from Alice, who heard it from Millie, who heard it from Ruth Fuller, the baker. One of the policemen went in to get some bread on his way home early this morning. Ettie nibbled on a fingernail. A second death in the barn. Ettie considered that it looked less likely that Thea's Englisher friend from the market was to blame. But who was? Yeah, that's 2 deaths. And I know something else, Doris continued without drawing breath. Wilma had been telling me that she's seen strange lights in the barn ever since Thomas came back from Rumspringa, nearly every night and even after his death. When she first told me, I didn't take any notice because I thought she'd gone daft and was thinking Thomas was trying to contact her or something. But now... What kind of strange lights? Elsa May asked. Like a flashlight? Ava asked. Doris shrugged her shoulders. She didn't say, just said that there were lights. She tried to send Samuel out to see if there was anyone there, but he kept telling her it was nothing and to go back to sleep. He finally agreed last night and went out to check, and just as well he did because he caught the killers. Who were they? That I'm not sure of. All I know is that there was a man and a woman. What are you doing out so early, Doris? I was just taking Alice some eggs. She's not been feeling too well lately, and I thought she might be able to use them. Danke for stopping by and telling us, Doris. I thought you might be able to use the information to tell that detective friend of yours, Ettie, about the lights in the barn all the time, I mean. I suppose Wilma might have already told the police, but then again, she might be too upset to think with a level head. Doris stopped speaking and looked at the 3 of them. Where are you all headed at this hour of the day? We are going to the library. What for? Ava wanted to use the computer, and we're going along for the ride. Yeah, we don't get out much these days now that we don't have a buggy of our own, Elsa May added. So you'll tell your detective friend about all the lights every night in the barn, Ettie? I most certainly will. Denke, you've been a wunderbar help. Doris's face beamed with delight. I'll see you all on Sunday. Doris clicked her horse onward. Ettie got back into the buggy. What do you think of that? We should go to the police station to see who got killed and who did it. That's right. There's no use looking anything up on the internet unless we know more, Ava said. He could have the killer or killers arrested already. Okay, I guess the library's not that far from the police station. Let's go. When they arrived close to the station and Ava parked the buggy, she said, I'll stay here. I find the detective a little intimidating. So do we, Ettie said with a laugh. We won't be long, Elsa May said as she got out of the buggy. As they walked along the sidewalk toward the station, Ettie asked her sister, Why did you say we mightn't be long? You know we have to wait a long time for him sometimes. Ava's a big girl. If we're too long, I'm sure she'll come looking for us. I suppose so. I wonder who could have been murdered, Elsa May said. I hope it wasn't any more of Thomas's family. How would Samuel and Wilma cope with another of their kinner being taken from them? Let's just find out. There's no use putting the cow before the horse, or the bull before the plow. Goat before the cart? Or is it the— Stop! You're grating on my last nerve, Elsa May blurted out. That's not very nice, Ettie murmured to herself. It's the cart before the horse. Are you sure? Ettie asked. Yeah, snapped Elsa May. Ettie and Elsa May walked up the steps of the police station, and once they were inside, they stopped in front of the officer at the front desk. Good morning, the young man said after he glanced up at them. Good morning. I wonder if we might have a word with Detective Kelly. Have a seat, and I'll tell him you're here. Ettie and Elsa May headed over to the row of chairs. Most of the officers knew them by now and didn't need to ask their names. Minutes later, a frazzled-looking Detective Kelly appeared at the end of the corridor and waved them into his office. When Ettie sat down opposite him, she noticed that he looked worried and pale. Are you all right? You look dreadful. I've been better. He laced his fingers together and placed them on the desk in front of him. I'm guessing you've heard there's been another murder at the Strongberg farm? Elsa May nodded. We did, but we don't know any of the details. A man was hit over the head in the barn last night. Samuel Strongberg called us after finding the body. Who was killed? Ettie asked, hoping it wasn't another of the Strongberg family. It was Bart Crittenden. Thomas's friend? Ettie asked. The one in prison? Elsa May added. That's the one. How did he get out? Did he escape? Ettie asked. No, he was just released on parole yesterday. Ettie pushed her lips together. What was he doing there in the barn? That's what we don't know yet, Kelly answered. According to Mr. Strongberg, his wife insisted he go to the barn because she'd seen lights flickering around in the barn at night for the past several weeks. When he looked out the window, he saw nothing but darkness. To make Mrs. Strongberg feel better, he went out to investigate. That's when he found the body lying in the barn, and he caught the two people red-handed. And you'll be surprised to find out who they are. Who? Ettie and Elsa May chorused. Thea Hersh and Austin Hogue. Nay, that's not possible. Thea would never. Thea would have no reason to. It seems as though Thea has gotten involved with Austin and has gone down a bad path. What do you mean? Ettie asked, knowing without a doubt in her mind that Thea was innocent. Austin has a record a mile long, minor drug charges, petty theft, and the list goes on. That's awful, Elsa May said. Taya trusted him and thought he was such a nice young man.
Well, now they're both under arrest on murder charges. They're both sticking to the same story about finding the body there when they got there.
Perhaps it's the truth, Elsa May said.
Neither of them will say why they were there.
Oh, poor Taya, Ettie said, shaking her head.
Can we see her? Elsa May asked. Kelly said, she's still being questioned.
Do her parents know she's here?
She refused a phone call. We'll have to call her father right away, Elsa May said. Be my guest. You can talk to Simkis on the front desk, and he'll find the number for you.
Elsa May hurried out to call Taya's parents, and Ettie leaned over the desk toward Kelly. I'm sure this is just a terrible mistake.
It's possible, but until they tell us why they were in the barn on the exact night that a man was murdered, I can't help either of them. He shook his head. It's not looking good for Austin with all his priors.
Ettie straightened up. That shouldn't matter. Kelly held up his hands.
They were caught with the man's blood on them. Literally.
Ettie huffed and folded her arms in front of her. I've watched Taya grow up. She wouldn't have been involved in anything bad, no matter what company she kept. Now, come to think of it, you mentioned lights in the barn before tonight. Doris was telling me about the lights earlier today, too. I wonder why there were lights in the barn. Do you think there were drugs hidden in the barn?
What makes you say that?
You said that this man, Bart something or other, was in jail for smuggling drugs. What if he had a lot of drugs and had to hide them before he went to prison, and he hid them in Strongberg's barn? Or perhaps he had someone else hide them there. Drugs are worth a lot of money, aren't they? And people kill for money. The detective nodded.
That's one theory, and we're already looking into that.
Ettie, are you saying Thomas would be involved in something like that? Do you think Thomas knowingly hid the drugs in the barn? Elsa May asked. Ettie turned around to see her sister heading back into the room. I didn't see you there. What did Levi say?
He found Taya missing this morning. They've been everywhere looking for her, and he was just in the barn getting a fresh horse when I called him. The poor man is distraught. He's coming here right now. Elsa May sat down. You think Thomas could have been involved in something, Ettie?
Maybe, Ettie said. There is that possibility. He had been acting strangely.
I don't think so. Elsa May shook her head in disgust at her sister.
In my experience, you can't really know someone and what they would and wouldn't do.
I quite agree, Ettie, Detective Kelly said. Elsa May sighed. Well, you would, wouldn't you, Detective? You don't trust anyone. You've told us that before. In my profession, I can't afford to trust anyone.
Have you had a chance to look into those names Ava mentioned last night? Ettie asked Detective Kelly while studiously ignoring her sister. I've got people working on it. I should know more later today. He leaned across the desk and asked them, How did you hear about the murder so fast? We heard it from Doris, who heard it from... He held up his hands. Stop. Spare me the details. I should have known better than to ask. Elsa May chortled. We better go now, Elsa May. Ettie remembered that Ava was waiting for them. I'll be in touch to let you know if we find out what Bart Crittenden was doing in the barn, and I know you'll be anxious to hear about Taya and her friend. Would you mind letting us know? Elsa May asked. Of course I will. This is proving to be more than someone accidentally falling to his death. Good, Elsa May said. I don't mean about Thomas falling. I meant good about you letting us know and keeping us informed. Did you hear that, Ettie? No, I wasn't listening. I corrected myself before you could do it. Ettie scrunched up her nose. There was no need for Elsa May to say things like that in front of the detective. She remained quiet, burying her annoyance. Kelly nodded, then he pushed out his chair and stood up.
That's all I can tell you, ladies, today.
When they were nearly at his door, Kelly added,
Please don't do anything silly. All I want the two of you to do is keep these open.
he tugged at the bottom of his ears. Ettie and Elsa May nodded before they turned and headed out of his office and hurried out to tell Ava the dreadful news about Thea and her young friend being arrested. They knew it was more important than ever to find out if there might be someone else the detective and the police department could turn their attention to. Chapter 13. At the library, Ava prepared to look up the names that Doris had given them. Let's see. Ava glanced at her notes. Let's see what we can find out about the woman who was stalking Thomas.
Doris didn't know about that one, did she?
Elsa May said with a chuckle. Nay, or if she did, she didn't think to tell us. Oh, she would have told us if she'd heard about it. Don't you worry about that. Eddie peered at the screen as Ava typed the name of Brianna Taylor into the search bar. The first thing that came up was an online news article with her picture. Is that the same Brianna Taylor? There could be other people with that name, Eddie said. We'll soon know. Ava scrolled through the article. This is from 2 years ago. She was arrested in connection to a drug ring. I'm guessing that has something to do with drug smuggling? Quite possibly, Ava answered. A drug ring is a group of people involved in distributing drugs, possibly smuggling or selling, and maybe both. I suppose they would have to sell them after they smuggle them. Otherwise, what would be the point? Eddie asked.
What else are you finding out, Ava? Elsa May asked.
This is not the woman who was at the funeral, I'm sure of it. Although it could be. That's not much help, Eddie blurted out. I'm sorry, Ava. I know you're doing your best. I don't know. It could have been her.
We'll worry about that later. See what else you can find out, Ava.
Eddie saw Elsa May glaring at her, shaking her head behind Ava's back, and Eddie knew she should keep her mouth closed and not be so discouraging to their young friend. After all, Ava was only trying to help them. It mentions some other names here, but no one we know of. Elsa May peered at the screen.
Write them down anyway.
I will. Once Ava was through reading that article, she went back to the search page. That's all I can find on her. Ettie frowned. She was hoping to find out a whole lot more. Could your friend from the DMV find out where she lives? Sure, I can call him when we finish here.
What about the man, William Spreed? Elsa May asked.
I'll look him up. Now, I asked Jeremiah and found out that Thomas had gotten into the roofing business. On his own? I think so. Jeremiah would have mentioned if he were in business with someone else. You know what he's like about things like that. And the bishop wouldn't approve of Thomas going into business with Englishers, so we know he wasn't in business with Englishers. That's true, Ettie said. Did Jeremiah mention anything else about Thomas? I couldn't ask too much. I asked if he knew if he had gotten any large orders for work, and he said he'd heard that he'd gotten a contract to do all the roofs in a new housing development on the edge of town.
I guess that would be worth a lot of money, Elsa May said.
Enough to kill for? Ettie shook her head. That doesn't sound right to me.
Well, what if Thomas beat out William Spreed, won that contract, and then had an argument with the man? Thomas had many disagreements with people lately, as we found out, Elsa May said.
I found William Spreed's photo, and it's not the man who was at the funeral, Ava announced as she scrolled through some news articles. After they had read about William Spreed and his roofing business on the screen, they found a website and scrolled through the staff photos. Look there, Ava pointed at the screen. I can't see without my knitting glasses, Elsa May said. Ettie peered at the screen, moving closer. Is that Thomas? Yeah, it looks like Thomas. This is an old photo of William Spreed's staff. It seems that Thomas once worked for Spreed. Ah, some pieces are coming together, Elsa May said. Then Thomas set up shop on his own and stole some business away from Spreed. There could be a reason to want Thomas out of the way, but that doesn't explain why Bart was found dead in the barn. Nay, it doesn't, Ettie, but I feel we're one step closer, Elsa May said. Ava, still staring at the screen, asked, Should we pay Mr. Spreed a visit? Yeah, I think we should, Ettie said. Ava and Ettie both looked at Elsa May. Yeah, that's the logical thing to do, right after we find Brianna Thomas's address. I'll take down the address of his business. After Ava had scribbled down some notes from the computer screen, she said, I'll phone my friend now. Ava stood up and made her way to the public phone out at the front of the library. What good will having Brianna's address be? Are you thinking we should say something to her? I'm not sure yet, Elsa May said. It wouldn't hurt to have it, just in case. I hope Ava's friend doesn't get into trouble. Yeah, he would if anyone knew he was giving out addresses. We'll have to hope his bosses don't find out. Ettie was looking forward to talking to Mr. Spreed to see what he'd have to say. Ava headed back toward Ettie and Elsa May, holding up a piece of paper. I've got it. I've got her address. Goot, Elsa May said with a sharp nod of her head. Shall we go to Spreed's place of business first? Yeah, we will, but it's going to be too far for the horse, and it'll take too long. I'll have to take the buggy back home, and then we can call for a taxi from there. Sounds like a plan, Ettie said. Ava, didn't you have to help your mother today? I did, but I was able to change it to later in the week. Very good, Elsa May said. Now we'll see what Mr. Spreed has to say. Chapter 14. After the taxi had pulled up at an industrial area, the three ladies got out and looked around. Are you sure that this is the right address? Ettie asked. Look over there. The three of them looked to where Ava was pointing. There was a colorful sign that read Spreed Roofing. I guess this must be the place, Ettie said, hurrying over to the tall wire fence behind the sign. They walked through the gates in a high double fence that enclosed many sheds. In the distance, they saw a couple of men carrying large sheets of metal. They walked into the first building and were pleased to find a lady behind a desk. She was an elderly lady with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back into a bun. Can I help you, ladies? Elsa May spoke. We're looking for William Spreed. I'm sorry, but Mr. Spreed died well over a year ago. Can anyone else help you? Ava spoke up. We thought William Spreed was the owner of this place. We must have had the wrong information. He used to be the owner, but now the owner is Roy Strongberg. He's out at the moment, but I can have him call you. Ettie was stunned. She didn't know what to think about Roy being the new owner. She stood there with her mouth open and was glad that Ava was able to speak. Perhaps we'll call back later, Ava said. Are you sure someone else can't help you? Did you want a quote on something? We'll call back, thank you. Elsa May was the first to walk out the door. They hurried out of the gates before they even spoke to one another. Did you know that, Ava? Do you mean did I know Roy had a roofing business? She shook her head. Nay, I knew nothing of the kind. I didn't know what he did. This is a huge surprise, and it means that Roy and his brother were in competition to one another. Were the brothers enemies or friends? Ettie searched her memory banks for clues. They were in direct business competition, as you said, Ava. Well, from the way Roy told it, they were friendly. And nothing's ever been said to the contrary. They went to the market together on the day Thomas died. Nay, it's just not possible. What are we thinking? Roy wouldn't have killed his brother just because they were in the same line of work, Ettie said. All the same, Ettie, it's odd that no one knows Roy owns this business, Elsa May added. He probably left the name as Spreed Roofing because he wanted to keep the customer base that William Spreed had. Otherwise, people might think he only did Amish houses, Ava suggested. Ettie nodded. Let's go up to the main road and see if we can get a taxi from there. Did you hear anything at the funeral about a falling out between the brothers, Ava? Nay, not at all, Ettie said. At the beginning of the funeral, Roy did seem kind of odd. Remember he ran out of the room and then we followed him and asked him questions, Elsa May? Yeah, I remember. What you said is right, Ettie. It's a different thing to have a falling out, and it's another thing to kill someone. Even if the brothers weren't getting along, it's a big stretch of the imagination to think that Roy would have killed his own brother, or anyone else for that matter. Should we visit Roy and Thomas's parents again? Elsa May suggested. Ava said, is that before or after we go to see the girl who was in love with Thomas? I've got a better idea, Elsa May said. What is it? A bite to eat. That's the best idea I've heard for a while, Ettie said. Chapter 15. Elsa May, Ettie, and Ava went to the market to have lunch at one of the little cafes inside the farmer's market. Why don't we visit Doris? Ava asked before she finished the last bite of her egg and lettuce sandwich. Ettie agreed. Yeah, she seems to know a lot, and she doesn't live too far from here. Let's not waste any time, Ava said. We'll take her a pie, Ettie said. Elsa May dabbed at the corners of her mouth with the paper napkin. We must come here again. That was lovely. Ava and Elsa May waited while Ettie went to get Doris a pie. She never liked to go to anyone's house empty-handed. It's so nice to see you here. I get so few visitors these days. It's not like it was years ago, Doris said when she opened her door to see the three of them standing there. We brought you a pie, Ettie said. It's a blueberry pie. Wunderbar! Doris took the pie from Ettie and opened the door fully. While I put the pot on, show Ava the way to the living room. She hasn't been here before. When Doris joined them on the couch, Ettie spoke first, bringing up the reason they were there. We have some questions to ask you. Of course. Go right ahead. Is it about Thomas? Yeah. Do you know how well Thomas and his brother Roy got along? They had a big falling out months ago. No one is supposed to know this, but Roy was working, for an Englisher, and then he bought the company. He was supposed to be going halves with Thomas, so they would be 50-50 owners of the business. And then, all of a sudden, Thomas found the papers were signed, and Roy had cut him right out of it. That's terrible, Ava said. Ettie clicked her tongue. I can imagine that Thomas would have been very upset about that. He was. That's when he started his own business. Elsa May leaned forward. In opposition to him? His brother? He had no choice but to work for himself. He didn't want to, but he found it hard to get employment, and now he couldn't go into business with his brother. It wasn't as though he was trying to outdo his brother because the business Roy bought was quite large and successful. I once heard Thomas say he didn't know where Roy got all his money from. You see, since Roy bought the business, it went downhill. But Roy still seemed to have a lot of money. That's one thing I thought odd. Ettie gave Elsa May a sidelong glance. Elsa May sat upright slightly, still leaning forward, and spoke in a quiet voice. That day at the market, the last day Thomas was alive, he had an argument with Austin. Doris nodded. Yes, that's right.
Do you know if Roy drove Thomas to the market?
That would be very unlikely. As far as I knew, they still weren't talking to one another.
That's strange, Ava said.
What do you mean? Doris asked. Ettie said, "The thing is, Doris, that Roy says he drove his brother to the market that day." "What exactly did he say?"
Doris squinted.
"We heard this. Thomas was visiting with Roy at his house, and then Roy's wife, Olive, wanted some meat, so Roy said he would go to the market, and Thomas said he would go with him. Roy drove Thomas home after the market, and he said Thomas wanted to tell him something that had been bothering him."
Elsa May continued with the story. And so Roy dropped Thomas at their parents' house while Roy took the meat back to Olive to cook for dinner. Then Roy went back to hear what was troubling Thomas. And that's when he found Thomas in the barn. On hearing the story back from Elsa May's mouth, the whole thing seemed implausible to Ettie.
"Perhaps the brothers were trying to sort out their differences," Ava suggested. "You know the family better than we do, Doris. Do you think that's what happened?"
Doris shrugged her shoulders.
"I don't know. I had heard that Roy found Thomas in the barn, but I had no idea that they were now speaking to one another. Now, how about a cup of hot tea and some of that pie?" Doris asked.
Chapter 16. Do you have something to tell me?
Detective Kelly asked the next day when Ettie and Elsa May sat before him in his office. "We found out that Roy, Thomas's brother, owns Spreed Roofing, and Thomas had just outbid him on a job, a very lucrative job from what we found out." Detective Kelly put his head to one side.
So you think that Roy might have killed his own brother?
Ettie gulped when she remembered they had agreed not to mention that to the detective, and that was also why she could feel Elsa May glaring at her. Ettie scratched her chin and looked over at Elsa May, hoping she'd say something to get her out of the hole she'd dug.
We were wondering if you'd found out anything about the girl who was stalking Thomas, Elsa May said. She seems to have vanished. We ran her through the system and found she has an arrest record as long as my arm.
"Drugs?" Ettie asked.
Drugs and petty theft. We found out Spreed was dead, but we didn't know that Roy owned his firm. According to our records, the firm is now owned by...
He picked up a sheet of paper lying on his desk.
A company known as Bluefish.
Ettie cleared her throat. "So, you're saying that Bluefish is Roy Strongberg's company?" According to the woman at... Kelly leaned forward.
What woman?
Elsa May took over.
Ettie and I went to William Spreed's place of business simply to ask him a couple of questions.
Kelly shook his head and he propped his chin on his knuckles with his elbows on the desk.
What were you thinking? Were you going to ask him if he killed Thomas for outbidding him on a job?
"You knew?"
We didn't know Bluefish was Roy's company, no. I've got someone looking into it now, and we would have found that out today, Kelly continued. I told both of you simply to keep your ears open and nothing more. I don't want you to go snooping around. It could be dangerous.
"We didn't know," Ettie said, because she couldn't think of anything else to say. Kelly reached into a drawer and pulled out a small pill bottle. He shook one of the pills into his palm and tossed it into his mouth, following it by a mouthful of water. When he looked up to see Ettie and Elsa May staring at him, he said,
Just a small Xanax.
Ettie and Elsa May exchanged glances. They recognized that name and knew what the medication was used for. "Okay," Ettie said, nodding, not wanting to upset him further.
You really should try some deep breathing and perhaps a hot peppermint tea, Elsa May suggested to the detective.
He stared at Elsa May with his lips turned down at the corners. Ettie cleared her throat again. So, Detective, where are you up to with the investigation? Do you now think Thomas was murdered?
And what have you found out about the death of the young man? What was his name? Bart?
Elsa May added. Kelly took a deep breath.
He was hit over the head with a piece of 2x4. We found it in the corner of the barn. It had both Bart's blood on it and Thomas's. So we know Thomas didn't die accidentally. Bart was also stabbed.
Ettie gasped. That's terrible.
And it was missed the first time by your team? Elsa May asked.
Ettie and Kelly stared at Elsa May. Ettie said, Missed what? He just said that Bart was stabbed as well as hit over the head.
Oh, stabbed, was he? That's not nice. I didn't hear that part. I was talking about the 2x4 that your team only just found in the corner of the barn, Detective. I don't know that it was missed. Maybe it wasn't there after Thomas's death. The killer could have taken it with him. Anyway, it looks like there are hundreds of bits and pieces of wood floating around in that barn. I've got the team still out there pulling the barn to pieces. Not literally, of course, but they're combing the barn for evidence as we speak. That's something we couldn't do before because Thomas's death wasn't ruled as a murder.
I see, Elsa May said. Did the wood have any other DNA on it? From the killer, perhaps? A third person? Ettie asked.
No. There were no other significant amounts of DNA found on the wood in question. Otherwise, the conversation we'd be having right now would be quite different.
Chapter 17. When Ettie and Elsa May left the police station, Ettie insisted on visiting the Strongbergs. They would be feeling so awful. Imagine finding another person in their barn like they found their son, and imagine their shock at finding Thea in their barn.
You're right, Ettie. We should go and see how they're coping with everything.
When Ettie and Elsa May arrived at Wilma and Samuel's house, they saw 2 white vans parked outside the barn with men in white suits going in and out of the barn door. They've still got the evidence technicians here.
They look like beekeepers with that get-up on, Elsa May chuckled. What's going on here? The taxi driver asked as he pulled up close to the house. Is this where that man was found killed?
That's right. Ettie paid the driver, realizing that it must have been on the news. They never read the news and had no radio or television. They only read the Amish newspapers to keep up with local Amish events, mostly the Bulletin. I wonder if they've found anything yet, Elsa May said, looking toward the barn. They mightn't know until they take things back for processing. The front door of the Strongberg house was flung open before they'd even knocked.
Come in, it's nice to see a friendly face, Wilma said. Ettie stepped inside, directly behind Elsa May. Elsa May spoke first. We heard what happened, and we came to see how you are.
I'm shocked. That's how I am. Let's sit on the couch. We heard that Samuel found someone dead in the barn, Ettie said once she'd sat down.
Yeah, it was dreadful. He was shocked and didn't know what was going on.
Did he see anyone else beside Thea and her Englisher friend?
Nay, and there must have been someone else because I saw lights in the barn earlier, and when the police came after we called them, there was nothing in the barn that would have created the light. There was no lamp, no light of any kind, not even a flashlight. That is odd. While we were waiting for the police, the young man told Samuel that he didn't turn his flashlight on at all, and Thea confirmed that. Now I wish that Samuel never called the police because they seem to think that Thea and her friend killed that man. Yeah, they do, Elsa May commented. I don't know what they were doing in the barn. They didn't say. Well, they didn't say anything that made sense.
When did the lights start in the barn?
There were lights on in the barn for weeks before Thomas died.
I kept telling Samuel I saw lights, but he didn't get out of bed to look. Samuel's like that at night. He's just so tired by the time he gets to bed. I have a nap in the afternoon, so I don't sleep as solidly as he does. What did the lights look like? Like there was someone looking around inside the barn. A flashlight? Elsa May asked. Yeah, a flashlight. Not a lantern, more like a flashlight. Now I know I was right. There must have been people or a person looking around the barn. What do you suppose they were looking for? I couldn't think what it might be, said Ettie. On a different subject, Wilma, did you ever meet any of Thomas's Englisher friends from when he was on Rumspringa? Do you think it might have been one of them? Elsa May scrunched her shoulders up to her ears. I don't know. Nay, I didn't meet any of them. There was a girl who came here looking for him once. What was her name? She didn't give me her name, and neither did I think to ask. I didn't like the look of her, so I didn't ask her to stay and wait for him to return. I didn't know where Thomas was that day, and that's what I told her. Was that when he first came back from Rumspringa? Yeah, it was, because I remember thinking I hope he hadn't been involved with that girl. There seemed to be something wrong with her. She was affected in some way. Ettie knew that Wilma most likely detected that the girl might have been affected by drugs. What did she look like? She was small and thin, with dark, long hair. It looked like she'd drawn on her eyebrows with a felt-tipped pen, and her hair was so dark it was almost black, and it was thin and greasy-looking. She looked like she needed a good bath, and I'm not saying that to be nasty. I mean she really looked unclean. Did she say anything else, like why she wanted to find Thomas? Nothing. Now I must get you some tea. I won't be long. Once Wilma was out of the room, Ettie leaned over and whispered to Elsa May. When she comes back, ask if Roy and Thomas ever had an argument. Find out if they were friendly right before Thomas died. Elsa May nodded. I'll try to work it into the conversation. Good. It would be a sensitive subject if they weren't getting along. Don't worry, I know what I'm doing. Wilma came back with a tray of tea and cookies. When she'd poured their tea, she offered them the plate of cookies. After each lady had taken one, Wilma sat down. Elsa May placed her cookie on the saucer and had a small sip of tea, and then placed her cup back down on the saucer. Wilma, how was it for you when Roy and Thomas had that big argument? Ettie froze in her chair and didn't know where to look. Didn't Elsa May just say that she knew what she was doing? What do you mean? Wilma asked. Elsa May frowned. When Thomas and Roy were going to buy that business and then Roy cut Thomas out, prompting Thomas to open his own firm? You don't know what you're saying, Elsa May. It wasn't like that at all. Elsa May tipped her head on the side, as though she were confused. Nay? Nay. Then what was it like? Thomas changed his mind about going halves in that business, and then by the time he changed it back, the deal had already been done. Because Roy was in business with others, he could do nothing about it. I see. But what would that matter? Couldn't Thomas have still bought a share of the business? That would have saved their big falling out. They didn't have a falling out. What are you implying, Elsa May? Nothing. Nothing at all. I'm just wondering how it was that they weren't getting along, and on the day he died, they were doing things together as though they were. Well, they were still talking to each other. They weren't going to let business come between them. Ettie thought it time to intervene. It's hard to ask you things, Wilma. Forgive us. We just heard some things and we don't know if they were true. And now Thea is involved with being found in the barn, and there are always rumors and talk going around, and most of these things aren't true. Go on, tell me what you heard, Ettie. I'm guessing it was about Thomas and Roy being enemies and having some kind of feud. Is that what you heard? Elsa May took over again.
That's about it. If you really want to know, this is what we heard. They had an agreement to buy the business when William Sprede died. Roy bought it and cut Thomas out of the deal. Thomas opened a firm on his own and recently won a large contract over Roy.
The last part was true. Thomas was quite pleased with himself for winning that contract. Not in a prideful way, but he was delighted that his workers would have continual work for quite some time. They were soon to run out of work, you see.
What's happening with the men Thomas had working for him? Elsa May asked.
Roy's come to the rescue there. He's been good enough to incorporate Thomas's business into his own, and that means the workers will benefit. That's what Thomas would have wanted. That's good of Roy, Ettie said.
Yeah, and I guess Roy's got that big contract now, too?
I'd imagine so. He never discusses business with me. I just hear bits and pieces when he's telling his father things. Ettie and Elsa May had asked one of the forensic team near the barn to call a taxi from their mobile. On the way down the drive to wait for it, Elsa May dug her sister in the ribs.
What did you think of that, Ettie?
Roy has profited from Thomas's death. That's what I know. Never mind about what I think.
Yeah, but that doesn't make him guilty.
Nay, it doesn't. It gives him a reason to want his brother out of the picture, though.
I wonder how much the roofing contract was worth.
I don't know. It must be worth quite a bit. We already know that Roy is extremely competitive because he cut his brother out of the partnership.
What are you thinking, Ettie?
I wonder how Sprede died.
Now you're letting your imagination run away with you.
I can't help it. This is just the way I think. Maybe we should find out if Kelly knows.
I think you're barking up the wrong tree.
Chapter 18.
Let's go over what we have so far, Ettie.
Now at home, Elsa May leaned down and picked up Snowy, who was pawing at her leg. She popped him in her lap, and then he was happy. Okay, what do we know? Ettie stared blankly at her sister.
You go first.
Well, we know that Thomas didn't get along with Roy. The woman who was stalking Thomas has disappeared, and then we've got the beekeeper, Austin, who was found with a second dead body in the barn, along with Thea. Then, what else?
Elsa May continued. Then we have the dead man, Bart, who was involved with drugs.
What was Bart doing in the barn?
If we find out why, that will lead us to who.
That makes sense. How do we find out why?
Elsa May stroked Snowy. It must have been something to do with drugs, because that seemed to be the connection between Bart and Thomas when they knew each other.
Back when Bart was arrested, he told the police Thomas had nothing to do with anything. It's back to the old theory that there might be something hidden in the barn. And what's more, I think that's what Thea and Austin were doing in the barn. They'd come to the same conclusion.
Yeah, but with all the police combing the barn, surely they would have found something by now.
What if Bart had found it and was then killed when he had it in his hands and they took it from him?
Good point, Ettie. He could have gone there with someone else to retrieve the drugs and then was double-crossed.
And when Thea went there with Austin, they stumbled over the body.
I think Thea knows something, and that's why she was in the barn. Let's go to the station and see if we can speak with her.
I don't think they'll let us.
We can try.
I'm right behind you.
Thea sat in her cell crying. She was wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, since her other clothes had blood on them from the man Austin and she had tripped over in the dark barn. The police had kept those clothes as evidence. Her parents had come, hoping to see her, but she wasn't allowed visitors until she went before the judge for her bail hearing.
She sat wondering what to do now that Thomas was dead. He'd shared some information with her, and now that he was dead, would it be all right to tell? On hearing the door of the outer cell block opening, she stood up to see that it was the detective who'd come to the house days ago to talk to her about Thomas.
Hello, Thea.
He said between the bars when he stood in front of her. Hello, I don't recall your name, sorry.
It's Detective Kelly.
She wiped her eyes. She was embarrassed because she'd been crying. Have you come to let me out?
No.
But I didn't do anything.
Well, why don't you tell me what you were doing in the barn?
She'd had different police asking her questions, but not the detective. I'll talk to Eddie.
Ettie Smith?
Yes.
I might be able to arrange that, if I'm in the room as well, and we'll have to record the conversation.
Thea swallowed hard. I don't know.
You're facing life in prison if you're found guilty.
I didn't do anything.
Did you know the deceased, Bart Crittenden? Or know of him?
I'll talk to Eddie. Kelly stepped back.
I'll send a car out to collect her.
He stepped in closer and stared in her face.
You wouldn't want to withhold any information. Anything you might know could be vital, even if you think it's of no importance.
The detective's eyes were wide, and he looked a little crazy, which made Thea a little fearful. She felt safe around Ettie. Kelly stormed out, and now she was alone again. She was in the end cell of a row of 6 prison holding cells. One thing she knew was that she didn't want to go to a real prison. It was bad enough being locked in a small cell, but she didn't know how she would handle being locked away with hardened criminals who'd committed horrendous crimes. She sat down on the bed, which was just a narrow bench covered by a mattress 1 inch thick. Pulling her knees to her chest, she went back to counting the rough bricks on the wall, since there was nothing else to do. She'd already prayed as much as she could. Chapter 19. Ettie and Elsa May stood in front of the sergeant at the front desk.
That was fast. Semkis only left minutes ago.
The gruff sergeant stared at them. Ettie frowned at him, not knowing what he was talking about. We're here to see...
You can head back to his office. I'll let him know you're here already.
The 2 sisters made their way down the corridor to Kelly's office.
He must have broken some speeding record to get you here so fast,
Kelly said, jumping up from his chair when they appeared in his office doorway.
This way.
Kelly pushed past them. Elsa May and Ettie looked at each other, shrugged, and then followed.
Where are we going?
Elsa May asked.
Didn't he tell you?
Who tell us? Ettie asked.
Semkis.
No, he told me nothing.
Taya's ready to talk, and she'll only talk if you're in the room, Mrs. Smith.
Okay, just as well we came when we did. Kelly drew his eyebrows together, turned back around, and continued walking. He turned to his right, heading into a room.
Sit anywhere you like. I'll have them fetch Taya.
Ettie and Elsa May waited a few minutes until a uniformed police officer brought Taya into the room in handcuffs. Ettie stared at her, barely recognizing her. She was wearing no prayer cap, and her fair long hair fell down way past her waist, and a baggy orange jumpsuit encapsulated her. Hello, Ettie. Taya then glanced over to the back of the room. Hi, Elsa May. When the lady said hello back to her, she managed a smile. Looking down at the brightly colored jumpsuit, she explained, My clothes got dirty and this is all they could give me.
She's not going to run off anywhere, Detective. Are those handcuffs really necessary?
Elsa May asked Kelly.
No, they are not.
Kelly gave a nod for the officer to take the handcuffs off Taya's wrists. Once she was free of the cuffs, the officer took her by the arm and guided her to a chair.
This is going to be recorded, Taya, and right up there is a video camera which will tape the conversation.
Detective Kelly pointed up high to the camera in the corner of the room. Okay, she said. Detective Kelly reached up and fiddled with the equipment, and then there were some back-and-forth technical conversations about the audio equipment with someone in another room. Are you sure we're allowed to be here? Ettie asked.
She can have someone with her when she's being interviewed, Mrs. Smith. So if it makes Taya more comfortable with you asking the questions or her speaking with you, I'm okay with that.
Thank you, Taya said to the detective.
Just relax,
Elsa May said to Taya from her chair at the back of the room. Taya blew out a deep breath. I'll try. The phone in the room buzzed and Kelly picked it up.
Yeah?
After a small silence, he continued in an angry tone.
No, they're not there because they're here already.
He hung up the phone and looked at Ettie and Elsa May.
You two just happened to come here just now without you knowing I wanted you here?
Yes, we came by taxi, Ettie said.
Elsa May added, to speak with Taya.
Detective Kelly scowled and muttered something under his breath.
Okay, we're all set,
Kelly finally said when he'd sat next to Ettie and opposite Taya.
What can you tell Mrs. Smith about what happened, Taya?
She took her gaze from the detective, swallowed hard, and looked at Ettie. I'm certain that Thomas was hiding something in the barn, and I thought it was probably drugs because I don't know what else it could have been. Did he tell you he was hiding something? He told me he was mixed up in something that he couldn't get out of. He was doing a favor for someone. Those were his exact words. What else did he say? Taya looked down at the table. Taya, if you know something, you should say so now. Austin's in trouble, too, and if you know he's innocent, anything you tell the detective could help him. Okay. Austin had nothing to do with anything. I was the one who talked him into going to the barn with me. He didn't even want to. I had the idea that Thomas might have been hiding drugs for his old friends or his brother. His brother Roy? Yes. Thomas told me that he hid drugs in the house once, and Roy found them and took them away. Thomas first thought that Roy destroyed them, and then he thought that Roy might have kept them or sold them. Why would he think Roy sold them? Surely he was trying to protect his younger brother. Taya shook her head. I don't know. I'm just saying what Thomas told me. He didn't say why he thought that, but Thomas was in trouble when he couldn't give the drugs back to them, and he got into things deeper and had a dreadful trouble getting out of it. They made him work for them.
So he was guilty,
Kelly murmured to himself. He was scared of them. Taya, do you know the man in the barn? Or had you ever seen him before? Ettie asked. I'm certain I saw him once before when Thomas was on Rumspringa. He came to the market with a couple of friends, and I'm sure one of them was Bart. The detective showed me a photo of Bart. It was too dark in the barn to see what he looked like. Ettie looked at Kelly. Taya and Austin were just a couple of innocent kids in a barn. Do you really think they're killers?
This is the first time Taya has talked about all of this, and I can't get a word out of Austin. If Austin talks and his story matches, I could see my way clear to dropping the charges.
Where do we go from here? Ettie asked.
I'll get some sniffer dogs out to the barn first thing tomorrow. If there were drugs hidden there at any time, they'll pick up the scent.
Good, Ettie said. Now, Taya, can you think of anything else that might be of help to the detective regarding Thomas or anything else about Roy? She shrugged her shoulders. All I know is that Thomas didn't trust Roy. When the interview was over, Taya was taken back to her cell.
It's odd that they spent Thomas's last day together then,
Kelly said as he walked out to the entrance of the police station with Ettie and Elsa May. Or did he? Ettie asked. We only have Roy's word on that. Did anyone see them together at the market? All we know for certain is that Roy was the one to find Thomas's body. You could speak to Roy's wife to see if that story he told us about him going to get meat for her at the market was true.
Kelly nodded. I'll do that. I'm surprised that you're not defending Roy. You normally are defensive of anyone who's Amish.
I'm just trying to get to the bottom of things, Ettie said.
Do you think Taya and Austin can go home now?
Elsa May asked.
I'll see if Austin will talk, and we'll go from there. I'm not making any promises.
Ettie and Elsa May left the police station and went to get something for dinner on the way home. While they were in the market, they wandered past Austin and Taya's side-by-side stalls. Elsa May walked to Austin's stall and picked up a jar of honey. A lady came over to her and said, "It's the best honey in the area." "Where's it from exactly?" "I'm not sure." "Whose stall is this?" Elsa May was trying to get information. "It belongs to my brother, Austin."
"And you don't know where your brother's hives are?"
"No, I don't."
"Doesn't it have to be far away from pesticides and such to be labeled as organic?"
"I'm not certain about that."
"Who collects the honey? Is it your brother, or does someone else do it?"
The girl looked annoyed and took the jar out of Elsa May's hands. "Look, it's just honey. It's basically sugar." Ettie wandered over to stand next to Elsa May. "It's nice of you to look after your brother's stall. Gone on vacation, has he?" "Yep." Elsa May continued.
"I'm interested in the honey because I only like the honey that is made in the local area."
"I'm sorry, I don't know where it's made." Elsa May looked over at a box behind the girl. She saw a tin of honey with a white and sky blue label. She knew it was cheap honey that the supermarket chain store sold.
"That's a shame. How long has your brother sold the honey here at the market?"
"Not long. Do you want a jar?"
"No, thank you," Elsa May said.
Ettie and Elsa May walked away, and Elsa May said to Ettie,
"I saw a huge tin of honey, the cheapest honey you can buy from the large supermarket stores. Don't you think that's odd?"
"I do." "What part of it was odd?"
"They sell organic honey, so what are they doing with that tin of honey?"
"Was it out in the open?"
"It was in a box, and it was partly showing. I recognized the label. You know how I like my honey. And she doesn't know where Austin has his hives. I would have thought he would take some kind of satisfaction in his honey production. Surely he would have talked to his sister about it, and especially since she's helping him out on the stall. That struck me as odd."
"Are you thinking he might be guilty of something after all? Taya said it was her idea to go to the barn that night, and he didn't want to go. We both know that Taya is innocent."
"Yes, and Thea is convinced Austin is innocent."
"Let's get something to eat and go home. Too much thinking is making my head ache."
"Good idea."
Chapter 20. The next morning, Detective Kelly was at Elsa May and Ettie's house early.
"I thought you'd like to know that last night Austin and Thea were released."
"Oh, good."
"What made you decide to do that?" Elsa May asked. "Once Austin found out that Thea had talked, he decided to talk too. He told us the exact same story that Thea gave us about why they were there and how they came to be there. Thea coming to his apartment and talking him into it, etc., etc."
Ettie heaved a sigh of relief. "That poor girl. I'd say she would have been glad to get home."
"Well, that leaves us with no suspects. We've got the dogs going to the barn today. I'll be there to see if there have been any drugs there."
"Good."
"I also talked with Roy's wife after you two left yesterday."
"You went to Roy's house?"
"Yes, and thankfully he wasn't home from work at that time, so I was able to talk with his wife by herself. She didn't know anything about Roy going anywhere with Thomas on the day he died. Of course, I didn't tell her what Roy's story had been. She said he went out in the afternoon, and that's when he found Thomas's body in the barn. That's all she knew. From her point of view, Roy wouldn't have had time to go anywhere with Thomas, and she admits that the brothers didn't get along."
"And she had no problem speaking with you?"
"No, she said she'd answer anything if it would help us with our investigations." "That's good," Elsa May said.
Ettie wondered if she should mention their conversation with Austin's sister at the market. None of it made sense to them, so she decided to keep it up her sleeve for the moment. He glanced at his watch.
We have the dogs going out to the Strongbergs at 12.
So Wilma Strongberg has seen no more lights in the barn?
I'll find out today when I go over there, Kelly said.
Thea was glad to get back to the market and be back in her normal routine. Her father wasn't too happy about Austin being under suspicion, but when Thea and the officer had explained everything to him, he calmed down.
How was it for you in jail?
Austin asked her as she was setting up for the day. She looked over to see him smiling. I didn't see you anywhere. There was no one in the other cells.
I must have been over on the other side. They have 2 blocks of holding cells.
It was dreadful. That bed was so hard and I got no sleep. They wouldn't even give me anything to read. All I did was count the bricks. I'm sorry to drag you into things. You didn't want to go with me, so I should have just gone by myself.
It was my decision to go. Besides, if you were by yourself, you would have found the body by yourself, and that would have been awful.
That's true, but I'm sorry you were in jail because of me. He waved a hand in the air.
Don't worry about that. I got to reconnect with my sister. She looked after the stall while I was away.
Taya looked into Austin's kind brown eyes. I feel better that some good came out of it.
It's best to look on the bright side of things.
I guess so. I'll try to do that more often.
How's that bike going? I'll still fix it if you want me to.
That's okay. Looks like I'll be saving up for a new one. The old one was too far gone. Taya didn't want to tell Austin that her father threw her bike away as punishment. She missed the independence of having a bike like so many of the other young Amish people had.
Your father pays you for being at the stall, doesn't he?
Austin asked. Yes, he does.
It shouldn't take too long to save up.
Austin continued to set up his display of honey. I hope so. Are you finding that the stall here is working out for you? You seem to be busy.
Yeah, it's working just fine. I'm making a good amount of money. People like anything that's labeled organic these days.
Some customers for Taya's cheese came along, so she turned her attention to them. She still felt bad for involving Austin, but he genuinely didn't seem to mind and wasn't holding any kind of grudge. If only he were Amish, and then she might be interested in him romantically, because he had all the qualities she wanted in a man. That afternoon, Ettie and Elsa May went into the station to find out if there had been any sign that drugs had been kept in the barn. Kelly was just on his way out of the station.
I don't have too long. I'm following up on another lead.
What is it? Ettie asked.
I'm sorry I can't say at this stage. I can tell you that the dog handler said that the dogs found that there had been cash and drugs in the barn. There was a trap door at the end of the barn, and it appears that the drugs and the cash were kept there. The dogs also picked up drugs in many other places around the barn, which is odd, and we're still trying to work it all out.
What are the chances that the dogs are wrong? Elsa May asked.
The dogs are never wrong. We've taken fingerprints of the trapdoor area, and we're waiting on those to come back.
He moved forward several steps.
I must go.
We won't hold you up.
Over his shoulder, he said, Keep in touch.
Ettie nodded. I wonder where he's going.
It's strange that he didn't tell us.
I guess he can't tell us everything. As it is, he probably lets us know a lot more than he should.
We've come all this way into town for nothing. It would have been helpful if he told us what his lead was. Do you think it's about the girl who was stalling Thomas?
That's stalking, Elsa May.
Elsa May chuckled. Stalking, then.
It could be. Perhaps he's found her. If only we had a car, then we could follow him.
Elsa May laughed some more. He'd never talk to us again if we did that, and he'd most likely have us arrested for doing it.
Ettie giggled. You're probably right. Let's go home.
Nay, why don't we go back to the address we have for Deanna Taylor? We can ask around the neighbors and see what they know.
Elsa May, her name wasn't Deanna. It was Brianna.
Elsa May shrugged. I'm not doing well today. I should go back to bed and start this whole day over.
Yeah, it's not like you to make so many mistakes.
I'm not familiar with these names, that's why. Now, do you remember Brianna's address?
I do.
Let's get a taxi.
I'm right behind you.
Chapter 21. Ettie started off by knocking on the door of Brianna's apartment, hoping someone might be staying there who knew where Brianna was. A small, young, dark-haired woman dressed in an old blue robe answered the door. She looked as though she was half asleep.
Hello, we're looking for Brianna Taylor.
Ettie recognized the woman they saw on the library computer. I'm Brianna. What's this about?
Ettie glanced at Elsa May, pleased to have found her at last. We are friends of Thomas Strongberg.
Okay. She stared at the two of them. I don't think I know anyone by that name.
He's dead now.
I'm sorry to hear that, but I don't know him. Did someone say I knew him?
His mother said you went to his house looking for him once.
Was he Amish, too?
Yes.
Ah, yes. That makes sense now. I did go looking for someone once, and he was Amish. It could have been the person you were talking about.
Ettie frowned, trying to work it out. Why did you look for him and go to his house if you didn't know him?
Brianna folded her arms across her chest and leaned on the doorframe. Someone asked me to go fetch him. He didn't meet someone where he was supposed to.
You were never boyfriend and a girlfriend?
With the Amish man?
Yes, with Thomas Strongberg.
She rubbed her nose. I don't know who told you that, but no. I don't think I ever even met him. When I went to his house, his mother said he wasn't there. Elsa May said, Who asked you to go to his house? What's this about?
We can't really say. We're just trying to piece some things together.
You'd be helping us greatly if you answered our questions. Unless you tell me what it's about, I can't help you. Elsa May stared at Ettie and then looked back at Brianna. Did you go to Thomas's funeral? I don't know the man. Why would I go to his funeral? We were told you were there. Brianna frowned and was clearly growing impatient. She stood straight and held the door as if she were about to close it on them. Well, I wasn't. I don't know what this is all about, but you're wrong about everything. I don't know anyone called Thomas.
You did go to his house, though.
Can you tell me why you're asking all this?
Thomas was killed by someone, and then another man was killed, a man by the name of Bart Crittenden.
Brianna held her stomach. Bart's dead?
Yes. You knew him?
She shook her head, but it was clear from her reaction she did know him. Brianna quickly hid her previous reaction, and her face was now expressionless. What does any of this have to do with me?
We were told that you were Thomas's girlfriend at one point.
You're wrong, I'm sorry. But I have to get ready to go to work. She took a step back inside the apartment.
Have you been away somewhere?
Ettie asked. Yeah, I was away visiting my brother. Brianna stepped back further and closed the door without saying goodbye. Ettie and Elsa May walked away from the apartment building. What do you make of that, Ettie?
Weird. It wasn't her at the funeral.
So she says, and that agrees with Ava's opinion from her picture on the computer. But she admitted going to Thomas's house. But who sent her?
That's what we need to find out.
Ettie felt Elsa May's hands on her shoulders, and then she was steered behind a tree.
What are you doing?
Shh! Look, it's Detective Kelly. They were now both behind the tree so Kelly wouldn't see that they'd been at Brianna's apartment.
This is where he was off to.
But how did we get here before he did?
He probably went somewhere else first. I'm glad he didn't see us.
They watched him until he disappeared into the apartment building.
Let's get out of here and go home real quick.
Elsa May pointed to the corner. There's a public phone up there. We'll call for a taxi.
Let's go. I hope he finds out more than we did.
Yeah, like who made her go to the Strongberg house? And what did she say? Someone made her go because Thomas wasn't where he was supposed to be.
She said he didn't meet someone where he was supposed to.
Maybe they tried to make him meet someone to get drugs or to pass some on.
Ettie and Elsa May hurried up the road to call the taxi. If Spreed and Brianna Taylor weren't at the funeral, who were the Englishers who were there? There was a man and a woman, according to Ava.
They could have been anybody. We'll ask around later and see if we can find out. But they may not have anything to do with the deaths.
It's an odd thing that Kelly didn't go to Thomas's funeral.
I think Thomas's death was still labeled as an accident at that stage.
Ah, yes, I think it was.
That night, Kelly showed up to see them right at dinner time. Perfect timing if you came for dinner. I hadn't planned to, but if you have enough, come inside. We've got plenty. Detective Kelly followed Elsa May to the kitchen. Ettie, I've invited the good detective to have dinner with us.
Ettie was in the kitchen, and she turned around to see him standing there. Wonderful. I thought that might be you at the door. Have you come to tell us what you found out from Brianna Taylor?
He pulled out a chair and sat down at the table. How did you know I talked to her? Never mind. Kelly shook his head and mumbled. It's probably best I don't know.
Well,
Ettie asked as she sat down at the table next to him. If she knows anything she's not saying.
I know it's turning this whole thing upside down, but what if it was Austin who organized this whole thing after all? He could be the Mr. Big of this whole drug thing.
Don't be daft, Ettie, Elsa May scoffed. Although it would explain why Austin's sister couldn't explain or didn't know where Austin's beehives were. He claims to have organic honey. Most likely the only thing he's guilty of is selling honey which he buys cheaply from a wholesaler and labels as organic when he wouldn't have any idea of the quality. Honey? Did you say honey? Kelly's eyebrows flew upward. Yes, Austin sells honey, and when he was in jail recently, we talked with his sister who was looking after his market stall, and the funny thing was she couldn't tell us where the honey was sourced.
And she's his sister. We thought she'd know.
Kelly looked worried. We saw a tin of cheap honey that he'd bought from one of those supermarket chain stores. I don't think there's a law against that, but I wouldn't really know. What if they're buying inexpensive honey and pouring it into their own jars and labeling it as organic? That's your department, detective, but I guess if it's not against the law, although it's at least unethical to make out his honey as something special when it's not. I'm not concerned about the ethics of selling honey and the claims Austin's made about it. There's something called THC marijuana concentrate, and it looks like honey. They were smuggling drugs in the honey. What are you talking about? Elsa May asked. He rubbed his chin. To keep things simple to explain, there's a way of making a drug concentrate, and the end result looks like honey. Have you heard of marijuana? Yes, Elsa May said.
So, were they selling that at the market as well as the honey?
Ettie asked the detective. They could have had a few special jars put aside for regular customers. And I'd guess that they might have been using Thomas's barn as a place to make it. He stared up at the ceiling and then said, That's why there were the crock pot and the hairdryer. He hit his head. I don't know how I missed it. There were so many things, all sorts of things, lying around in the barn that I didn't recognize the homemade drug-making equipment for what it was.
And maybe they were doing that at night, and that's why there were so many lights on,
Ettie suggested. Yes, it's possible. Kelly picked up his phone, and the sisters heard him tell someone he was heading to the market and needed backup. Then the ladies were left in the house alone. I'm guessing we're dining alone, Ettie.
Looks that way. I do wish he'd slow down and have a decent meal every now and again. The market would be closed by now anyway. He's not going to find anything tonight unless he knows where the honey is kept overnight.
When this whole thing is over, we'll have him for dinner.
Yeah, we'll have to roast him slowly. Ettie laughed at her own joke.
I'd reckon he'd be a bit tough,
Elsa May giggled. Ettie said, "Good idea, though. We'll feed him up. With a good meal in his stomach, it might help him handle all that stress."
Elsa May suggested. Why don't we try to forget everything for tonight, enjoy our dinner, and then think about it all again tomorrow?
I'd like that.
Chapter 22.
The next morning, when Ettie and Elsa May were eating breakfast, Ettie said, "I thought honey was just honey."
It just goes to show we're never too old to learn some new things, Elsa May said.
Austin and Thomas obviously knew each other. Austin probably had Thomas behave aggressively toward him at the market that day so the police would suspect him and then realize they were wrong.
Do you think Austin had planned to kill Thomas that day? Is that what you're saying, Ettie?
Maybe.
And you think Austin was the mastermind?
Ettie nodded. It's an explanation.
Too many things don't fit with that theory. It surely wouldn't make sense to Thomas if Austin told him to act aggressively toward him, and Thomas then was told to make a big deal out of Austin's words saying he'd kill him. What would that achieve?
Austin could have told Thomas that it wouldn't look good for them to appear friendly. If people thought they were enemies, no one would suspect they were in cahoots with one another with the drugs. Maybe Thomas held Bart's money for him, and when Bart got out of prison, he heard Thomas was dead, and he came looking for the money. Austin killed Bart because, well, it could have had something to do with the money. Bart could have come to him for the money.
Well, that's an idea. I wonder what Kelly will find. Ettie, why would Roy lie about being with Thomas on the day he died?
Ettie blew out a deep breath. Perhaps we should pay him a visit?
At home or at his work?
Ettie shook her head. Not at home in front of his wife.
We don't know if he'll be at his office. He might be out working somewhere.
We could take our chances. Should we take Ava with us? Ettie asked.
Good idea. She can explain about whatever it was Kelly thought was in the honey. She's mixed with people while she was at college who could have been into that kind of thing.
Put Snowy outside and we'll head to the phone and call a taxi, and then we'll call Ava and see if she's home.
Do we have to put him outside? Look at him sleeping so soundly, Elsa May said as she gazed lovingly at her dog.
That's all he does all day.
Well, that's what dogs do.
Not proper dogs, Elsa May. Just fluffy little dogs like Snowy.
Elsa May giggled. I'll put him outside in his kennel just in case we're gone for a long time. Although we'll miss our morning walk.
Just walk when we come home.
The sisters hurried down the road and called a taxi. While they waited for it to come, they called Ava and told her what Kelly had said about the honey. I've heard about the process. I'm not certain how it's done, but Kelly is right. I know they use a freezer, a hairdryer, and something to heat it with. I don't know any more than that, Ava commented on the drug-making process.
We're waiting for a taxi to take us back to Roy's place of business. We're going to try to find out why he lied about being with Thomas the day he died.
Do you think you should?
Yeah, why not? Sometimes these things are best left alone. He might have been protecting someone. Like who?
I don't know.
That's what we need to find out. And Elsa May and I think that Roy needs to say what really happened that day. Will you come with us? Nay, I can't. I'm just on my way out. Ettie said goodbye and felt disappointed. It would have been easier to go if Ava had gone with them. She's not coming with us. She's on her way out.
That's too bad, Elsa May said.
She thought Roy might have been protecting someone.
So, someone else might have been with him that day?
Possibly. Taya didn't see anyone with Thomas at the market. On the way to the Spreed Roofing main office, Elsa May leaned over and whispered to Ettie, "You don't think Roy is involved in this whole thing, do you?" "I wouldn't like to think so, but why did he lie about being with Thomas?"
Ava gave one reason, and there could be many more.
"We won't know if we don't ask." "How can I help you ladies today?" The woman at the main office of Spreed Roofing had recognized them from their last visit. "We've come to talk with Roy Strongberg. Is he in at the moment?" "Yes, he's down in the yard. I'll call him. Take a seat if you wish." Elsa May and Ettie looked behind them and went to sit in the waiting area. Before long, they saw Roy striding to the office. He walked inside and stopped still when he saw them.
Hello?
Ettie stood up. "Hello, Roy. Is there somewhere we can talk?"
Yes, come through to my office. He gestured toward a door on the other side of the room. Right this way. Once they were seated and the door was closed, Roy asked, "Is there something wrong?" "Quite possibly," Elsa May answered. "We know that you weren't with Thomas the day he died, and it seems odd to us that you lied about it." "Do you mind telling us why you did that?" "Like I told the detective when he asked the same question after talking to my wife. My wife has trouble knowing what are facts and what she makes up in her own head. I don't know if you already knew that or not, but she hasn't been well for some time." "I haven't heard that," Ettie said. "Anyway, I did go to the market with him, and he wanted to tell me something when we came home. I haven't lied about anything." "Whose idea was it to go to the market?" "I don't remember who brought it up. Could have been Thomas who mentioned it. He was sweet on a girl who worked there." "Did your wife say she wanted meat?" "Yeah, but I think we already said we'd go, and then she asked me to pick some up while I was there. Is that important?" "It might be. Do you know something I should know about how my brother died?" "We've heard a lot of different things," Elsa May added. "And we're trying to sort some things out." "One of the things we heard is that Thomas and you had a falling out. You were going to go halves in Spreed Roofing, and you cut him out at the last minute. And we heard that you two weren't talking after that." "Thomas pulled out of the deal at the last minute, and I nearly lost it to another buyer who wanted it. Anyway, I went into business with an Englisher, something I've regretted ever since. I offered to sell my shares back to them, and they're considering buying out my half share." "They?" Ettie asked, annoyed about hearing "they" again, just as she heard from Brianna. Who was this "they"? "People Thomas introduced me to. That's the odd thing. He knew them and advised me to have nothing to do with them." "That's odd." "At this time of my life, I just want to run my own business without having to consider partners. Thomas had the right idea. Is there anything else?" He stared at Ettie and then looked at Elsa May. "Yeah, that's all. Danke for answering the questions we had." He rose to his feet. "Not a worry. Can I call you a taxi or something? I'd drive you myself, but I've got a time crunch, a meeting with a client." "Yeah, Dinka, you could call a taxi for us." Ettie and Elsa May had heard nothing from Detective Kelly all day. Late that afternoon, Thea came to their house to speak to them while leaving her father waiting in the buggy. "Come in. Does your father want to come inside?"
Nay, I told him I wouldn't be long. Did you know that Austin has been arrested?
Kelly was here last night talking about drugs in the honey. Thea wiped some tears from her eyes.
It's true. Austin left early in the morning to turn himself in. He told me he was involved with drugs and said he'd probably go to jail. I thought Kelly would have been there first thing. The detective came about half an hour after Austin left. He came with police cars and dogs, and when they learned Austin wasn't there, they loaded all the honey into a white van. Don't be upset, Taya. Things will go easier for him now that he's turned himself in. That's what the policeman said, but I'm still sad. Thomas was my friend, and I got to like Austin, and I thought he was a good young man, and now they're both gone. Taya sobbed on Ettie's shoulder, and Ettie put her arms around her and patted her on the back, while looking helplessly at Elsa May. She had no idea what to say to comfort the girl. Elsa May put her hand on Taya's shoulder. Thomas is in God's house, and he's at peace. This is the best outcome for Austin if he was involved in something that he shouldn't have been involved in. As Ettie said, it's a good thing he turned himself in before they caught up with him. I hope they don't think that Austin killed Thomas, because he didn't.
You seem confident about that. Do you know who did kill Thomas?
Taya, if you know something, you must say so.
When Taya remained silent, Ettie tried a different question.
How did it all fit in? Thomas was making drugs, wasn't he? And Austin was helping distribute them in the honey jars? Were they in the whole thing together? Nay, Thomas wasn't doing anything wrong, and he wanted them to stop using his barn. They said they'd find a different place. Taya, who are they? I don't know. He only said they this and they that. He never named any names except Bart. Anyway, there was money, $20,000 that Thomas was hiding for Bart. Then I think someone killed Thomas for the money. I guess Bart went looking for his money too when he heard about Thomas's death. Thomas must have arranged to hide it in the barn, or Bart could have hidden it there before he went to prison. Who else knew about the money, Taya? I don't know. When did you learn all this?
She blinked as more tears fell.
Thomas told me and made me say I wouldn't tell anyone. He was trying to get away from all these people. He met them on Rumspringa, and he got involved in some bad things, and then they wouldn't let him go. He said they had got their hooks into him, but if I'd told someone, maybe Thomas would still be alive. You can't think like that. It'll do no one any good going over the past. Things happen exactly the way they're meant to.
Do you have any idea who could have killed him or Bart?
Nay, but probably one of the people who were organizing everything. I thought the organizer might have been Bart because of the hidden money, but I guess it wasn't. And he was still in jail until after Thomas died.
Taya looked over her shoulder.
I should go. Dot will want to be getting home. Will you be okay? Yeah, I'll be fine. Thank you for listening to me. My parents don't know any of what I've told you. Dot knows about Austin turning himself in, and that's all.
Later that night, Kelly knocked on the door of Elsa May and Ettie's house.
You raced out of here at top speed last night. What did you find out?
Ettie asked the detective as he walked to a chair in the living room. After he sat down, he breathed out heavily. There were drugs in some of the honey jars that were in some of the boxes. I got a team organized for a raid, and when we got there, Austin was back at the station turning himself in. He must have gotten a tip-off and decided to turn himself in rather than run.
How would he have known you were coming after him?
He shook his head. These things have a way of leaking sometimes. I'll be looking into it, don't you worry.
Elsa May placed her knitting in her lap. Looking over her thin-rimmed glasses, she asked,
Who killed Thomas and the other man? Do you know that yet? Naturally, Austin denies he had anything to do with the deaths. Strangely enough, he also denied knowing anything about the money. But we have a deposit in his account of just under $20,000.
"How did he explain that?" Ettie asked.
He can't. He claims he had no knowledge of it.
"Can anyone put the money into his account?"
Yes, that's the thing, you see. The money was paid into the bank by a person. It wasn't transferred electronically. We're looking at the bank's security footage tomorrow morning. We'll soon find out who paid the money into his bank account. If it's not him, he's not off the hook for the murders.
If it is him, it doesn't mean he is responsible.
I'm well aware of that, Mrs. Lutz.
We're about to have dinner. I'm afraid it's only pea and ham soup tonight, with bread that Elsa May made this morning. Would you care to join us?
I'd love to. Thank you.
During dinner, Detective Kelly said something surprising.
I'd like you both to come to the station tomorrow and look at that bank footage. There's a chance you might be able to identify the person if it's someone from your community.
Do you think it might be? Elsa May asked.
I've got no reason to believe so, but just in case it is, it would save time if both of you were there. An Amish man was killed, and his brother still has a question mark hanging over his head. We're not certain that Roy Strongberg is telling us the truth about everything. They were in direct opposition to each other.
It wouldn't make sense for the killer to put the money in Austin's account, would it?
It could, if they want to make Austin appear guilty.
Surely they would be aware that banks have security cameras these days. Kelly nodded.
We'll know more when we see the footage.
Ettie sat there eating her soup, careful not to slurp from the spoon. The sound of slurping irritated Elsa May, and she didn't want to be reprimanded in front of the detective.
This is delicious, he said after a couple of spoonfuls.
Thank you, Ettie said. I made the bread, but usually Ettie makes the bread. She's so much better at it than I. I like to keep my hand in every so often so that I don't forget how to make it, Elsa May chuckled. The detective broke off a piece of bread.
Mind if I dunk?
Eat it how you wish, Elsa May said. How about slurping? Ettie suggested. Everything is acceptable except for that. Unfair. Ettie placed another spoonful of soup into her mouth while Kelly gave a laugh.
I'll try not to slurp, he said. Although I believe in Japan it's a compliment to the chef to slurp your noodles. It shows it's so delicious that you can't wait for it to cool down. I've never been to Japan, but it's on my bucket list. When work slows down. Maybe when I retire.
You're not planning on retiring soon, are you? Detective Crowley finds it hard to fill in the time. I'm certain he misses his work, Elsa May said.
No, you'll have me around for a little longer. I'm not sure in what culture dunking bread in soup is acceptable.
Elsa May chuckled. It's acceptable in our house. After dinner, they sat in the living room. Detective Kelly had refused an after-dinner cup of coffee or a cup of hot tea. Who are your suspects so far? Ettie asked the detective.
We're still looking into the person who made the anonymous call. Tomorrow we should also have the phone records from the phone in the Strongbergs' barn. We'll be able to see who Thomas was calling.
What call was that? Elsa May dropped her knitting into her lap. You said there was an anonymous call? Ettie asked.
There was an anonymous call made informing us of Thomas's death. It was a male voice, and it was made from the public phone closest to the Strongberg house.
You never told us that, Ettie said. The Strongbergs thought the funeral director informed the police and the paramedics.
I thought you knew about that call,
He said. Ettie and Elsa May shook their heads.
It was from a man, and the voice was muffled as though he were trying to disguise his voice.
No, we never knew that. Roy told us they didn't think to call the police because Thomas fell off a ladder, and then he said the police weren't too happy that they weren't called.
But it appears they were called, but not by Roy, Elsa May added. On that mysterious note, I'll say good night.
Kelly rose to his feet. Don't you have any idea who called?
Kelly smirked. Not a clue. Perhaps you'd care to listen to the call when you're at the station tomorrow?
If you think it could help, we will.
There's a chance you could recognize the voice. I can't think why I didn't mention it to you.
I suppose there was a lot going on.
Are you sure it was a man's voice? Elsa May asked. Quite sure, Detective Kelly said while walking to the door. He turned around and said, I'll send a car for you tomorrow morning to save you getting a taxi. Thank you, Elsa May said. Ettie and Elsa May stood at the front door and watched Kelly get into his car. After he had driven away, Ettie said, You might as well let Snowy back in. Yeah, he'll be wondering what he did to be shut out for so long. Ettie giggled. The detective didn't like Snowy, and Snowy didn't seem to know it because he'd taken a liking to the detective, which he demonstrated by continually scratching at his legs. Elsa May leaned down and unlatched the dog door, and Snowy was in like a shot. He ran around sniffing everywhere Detective Kelly had been. He's gone, Elsa May said. Snowy looked up into Elsa May's face, and as though he could understand, he slowly walked over to his dog bed in the corner of the living room and made himself comfortable. Ettie sat down on the couch. I wonder who could have made that phone call. And who could have put the money in Austin's account, and why? I guess we'll find out tomorrow. We could find out who deposited the money, but it's going to be harder to find out who made that call. Hopefully, one will lead the detective to the other. Chapter 23. By 9 in the morning, Ettie and Elsa May were ready and waiting for the police car to collect them. Detective Kelly hadn't given them a precise time. He'd only said he'd send a car in the morning. Now it was 10 o'clock. Do you think he forgot? Elsa May asked. Nay, it's not likely that he forgot. He's most likely getting things organized, I suppose. There, that sounds like a car now. Elsa May walked to the window and looked out. It's not a police car, but the driver is one of the plainclothes policemen from the station. Let's go. Ettie and Elsa May headed out to the car. Once they arrived at the station, the policeman led them into a room where they found Detective Kelly seated, and on the wall was a flat-screen television. Have a seat, Kelly said. The policeman left them with Kelly, and both sisters sat down at the table. Are you ready? Seeing that the detective had a peculiar look on his face, Ettie asked, Have you already watched it? I have, and it'll be a good thing you're sitting down. Detective Kelly picked up a remote control and played the tape. Ettie and Elsa May stared at the screen. What are we supposed to be seeing? Elsa May asked. Wait, it's coming up in just a minute, he replied. Then, as plain as day, they saw an Amish woman enter the bank with a bag in her hand.
On looking closer, they both gasped. "It's Taya," Ettie said. The detective pressed the button and switched off the tape.
Yes, Taya deposited money into Austin's account.
"Why?" Elsa May asked. "What does Taya have to do with all this nasty business?"
That's what we're about to find out.
"What do you mean?" Ettie asked.
We're bringing her in for questioning. She'll be here soon.
Ettie put her hand to her forehead. What had Taya gotten herself into? Taya was at the market busily serving customers when she saw two stern-looking police officers coming her way.
We'll need you to come with us,
one of them said. Why? She looked around, wishing she had someone with her. Austin was gone, and her father had long since gone after bringing her to the market early in the morning. I haven't done anything, she added for good measure. The customers she had at the stall had quickly dispersed with the appearance of the police.
Come with us, he repeated.
I can't leave my stall.
Can you call someone to watch it while you're gone?
A lady from a nearby stall stepped closer and called out. Are you okay, Taya? Yeah, I'm okay, Beth Ann. I'm going to have to close my stall for a few hours. Can you keep an eye on it so nothing goes missing? Sure, I'll do my best. Thank you. Taya looked at the police. I'll just need to put a cover over. She reached behind her and got a large covering and flipped it across the stall. It was the same covering she used when she needed a bathroom break during the day. That had to be better than having her father come back into town and look after the stall for her. Then there was a chance he'd make a scene and refuse to allow her to answer any questions. Once Taya arrived at the station, she was shown into a room where the detective sat behind a table. A large flat-screen television was on the wall.
Good morning, Taya.
Good morning, Detective. What is this all about? Didn't I answer all your questions before?
Why don't we talk after I play this?
When Taya sat down, the two policemen who had driven her there left the room. Taya watched the bank tape, and she saw herself deposit the money into the bank. Kelly stopped the tape with the remote control and then placed the remote on the table in front of him and stared at Taya. After a long silence, the detective finally spoke.
Well?
What is the question? He breathed out heavily, obviously annoyed.
Why did you deposit that large sum of money into Austin's account?
It was Austin's account? The detective nodded. I didn't know whose account it was. All I knew were the numbers. There was no name on the paper.
What were you doing with that money? Where did you get it?
Thomas said if anything ever happened to him, I was to put the money into that account. He made me promise.
Did you have the money in your possession?
I got it out of the barn. Thomas told me where it was hidden.
Don't say any more.
He flipped a couple of switches on a camera on the wall until a red light came on.
I'm going to be recording you now.
Okay.
Would you like anyone to be present with you? Or would you like a lawyer?
No, it's okay.
I have Ettie and Elsa May here.
No, it's all right. I'll speak with you. Once the recording was underway, Kelly went over the same questions, and then he asked,
When did you get the cash from the barn?
The day of the funeral. I slipped into the barn when everyone was viewing Thomas's body in the house.
Did Thomas say why he wanted you to put the money in that particular account?
No, and I didn't ask why. I had no idea it was Austin's account. All I had on the piece of paper were numbers of the account and no name.
But you knew you were doing wrong, didn't you?
I knew Thomas was into some bad stuff, but I didn't know exactly what.
When you knew Thomas had that amount of cash, you must have realized that it came from some kind of crime.
Not really, no. How would I know that? I didn't. He could have saved it from working hard. He had just started his own business and was doing really well.
Mostly people leave a will. They don't have people promise to put the money in someone's account.
Thea shrugged. That's all I know. I don't know where the money came from or where it was going to. He was my friend and he asked me for a favor and I said yes. When I agreed to do it, I never even dreamed I'd have to actually do anything. I thought he was being silly. Do you think he knew someone was going to kill him?
I'm the one asking the questions here, Taya.
Okay. Taya glanced at the camera on the wall, wondering who would end up watching her recording.
Why did you keep this from me when you were questioned last?
I didn't want to get into trouble. I couldn't see how it would help you find who killed him.
Do you have any idea why Thomas would want the money put into Austin's account?
Taya shook her head. The only thing she could think of was that Austin might have agreed to hold it for Bart. But now Bart was dead, leaving Austin with the money. She bit the inside of her lip, not wanting to think Austin had done anything wrong. The involvement with drugs was too much already. Can I go back to my stall now? I really don't want my father to know I was questioned, and if I don't make enough money today, he'll know something's wrong. Kelly breathed out heavily.
Okay, interview's over. But I might need to speak with you again. I'll have your statement typed out, and as soon as you sign it, I'll have someone drive you back to the market.
Thank you. Chapter 24. While waiting for the statement to be typed, Taya was directed to the waiting area where she saw Ettie and Elsa May. What are you two doing here? Kelly wanted us to come in and see who deposited money into Austin's account. We had no idea it was going to be you. Taya nodded and told them everything she knew. She was then called to an interview room where she read through her statement and signed it before she was driven back to the market.
Why did Kelly want us to wait here?
More questions, I guess, Ettie said. And he asked about us listening to the phone call recording.
It's pointing to Austin, I'm afraid. They must have been in it together, the three of them.
Maybe Bart was the leader. He told Thomas if anything happened to him, he was to put the money in Austin's account.
Yeah, Ettie, but why put it into an account? Why not just pass the cash on to Austin?
Good point, Elsa May. That would make more sense. It's almost as though someone wanted Austin to look guilty. If there was money laundering going on, they wouldn't want to have to explain a large amount of money going into an account.
Exactly. Excuse me, ladies. They both looked up to see Simkus. Detective Kelly said he'd speak to you both later today. He had to go out on urgent business. I'll take you home.
Thank you,
Ettie said, while Elsa May grunted. Apparently, Detective Kelly had forgotten about the recorded phone call. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Kelly walked through their open door. "Knock, knock," he called out.
Come in, Ettie said, coming out of the kitchen. Elsa May's just out taking Snowy for a walk.
Seeing the smugness on his face, Ettie said,
Have you solved the case? You know who murdered Thomas and Bart?
"I do."
Have a seat. Don't say anything until Elsa May gets back.
He chuckled.
Would you like a cup of coffee and a slice of cake?
"That goes without saying."
Take a seat in the living room. I'll be right back.
10 minutes later, Elsa May walked in the door with a panting Snowy. Snowy perked up when he saw Detective Kelly. "Hello, Detective," Elsa May said. "Afternoon."
He solved the case, Elsa May.
"Why didn't you wait for me to hear it?"
We have. I don't know anything yet. I'm waiting for you to sit down to hear it.
Oh, goody, I'll just put Snowy outside. Yes, that would be a good idea, Kelly said before he took another mouthful of coffee. When Elsa May had Snowy safely outside, she sat down and folded her arms. Okay, I'm ready. Kelly looked at Elsa May and then looked at Ettie. What do you think happened, Ettie?
I don't know.
If you had to give it your best guess, what would you say?
Ettie pulled a face. Well, let's see now. Elsa May chuckled. Quiet, Elsa May. I need to concentrate.
Sorry.
My best guess would be Austin is the killer. Roy found out his brother, Thomas, was involved in things he shouldn't have been involved in, and that's why he didn't want to go into business with him. So Roy cut Thomas out of the deal after giving him some kind of ultimatum. Possibly Roy found out that Thomas's friends were using the family barn for things they shouldn't have been, and Roy told Thomas to make them stop. Thomas didn't. Eddie looked at the detective.
Go on,
He said. Austin gave Thomas instructions to have someone put money into his account if something happened to him. You see, Austin would have only given that instruction because he knew he was going to kill Thomas.
But why kill him at all? Elsa May asked.
Maybe he thought Thomas was going to talk. He was getting pressure from his brother.
Go on, Kelly said once more.
And the money went into an account because if someone had handed Austin cash, they'd know he was involved. Putting money into an account would keep Austin anonymous.
But not to the police when they checked his bank account, Elsa May added. It doesn't make sense that Austin would want money in his account if he were guilty, Ettie.
Ettie scratched her chin. She couldn't work out why Austin would have a large sum of money placed in his account. I've got it, Ettie shouted. Thomas wasn't instructed to put the money into Austin's account at all. That was Thomas's idea so the police would know Austin had killed him. Thomas asked Thea if anything ever happened to him to put the money into Austin's account, thereby pointing the finger directly at Austin.
Good work, Mrs. Smith. Detective Kelly clapped his hands.
Am I right?
Ettie stared at Kelly. We got a confession out of Austin today. I told him we were looking into Thea as the murderer, and then he caved and told us everything. He confessed to hitting Thomas over the head and making it look like an accident. Then he told us he knew Bart would come looking for his money, which Austin thought was still hidden in the barn. He killed Bart and then looked for the money. He couldn't find it, and he went home planning to try again another night. And immediately Thea knocked on his door and wanted to go to Thomas's barn looking for clues. To save Thea the trauma of finding a dead body, he had no choice but to go back to the barn with her. It was Austin all along, Elsa May said. Yes, it was.
It was nice of him to go with Thea so she wouldn't find the body alone.
A nice killer. You do think in a strange way, Mrs. Smith.
Ettie raised her eyebrows. He might be a killer, but he was also protective of Thea, which is a good trait.
Well, his one and maybe only good trait is not going to save him from going to jail for double homicide.
Does Thea know?
I've just come from her house. She's quite distressed, but she understands that Austin was guilty. I told her exactly what he told us, and she said it all fitted in with what she knew. We'll go and see her tomorrow, Elsa May said.
The poor girl. Thomas was a good friend, and now he's gone. And then she became friendly with Austin.
She can do without friends like Austin. If it weren't for him, she'd still have Thomas. Kelly reached for another slice of cake. What about Roy?
Did you find out why he made up that story about him being at the market with Thomas on the day he died? Elsa May asked the detective. And who made that anonymous phone call?
Roy was trying to protect his brother because he knew he was into some bad things. Roy had no involvement at all.
Detective Kelly continued.
Austin admitted he made the call after killing Thomas.
Thank you for coming over and letting us know. He smiled at them.
You're welcome. Our little arrangement is working out well. We've been able to help one another. You helped me, and then you were able to help Thea keep out of any trouble, and that led to Austin's confession.
And what of Austin's sister, who was helping him at the market?
Austin has no siblings or any family. He grew up in foster homes. She was probably someone helping him sell the drugs. We can't catch them all, I'm afraid, but at least we've got Austin, who was a major player.
All's well that ends well? Elsa May asked the detective.
I hope your Amish folk don't get themselves into any more trouble,
Detective Kelly said. Can you stay on for dinner?
Do I smell roasted chicken?
Ettie smiled. We have roasted chicken and roasted vegetables, but shouldn't it be our company you stay for? With a twinkle of mischief in his eyes, he said.
Yes, I would love to stay. And you're right, it is the company I'd like to stay for most of all, even though a roast is my favorite meal.
Ettie and Elsa May exchanged smiles, while Snowy scratched at the locked dog door, trying to get inside to Detective Kelly. This has been Amish Barn Murders, written by Samantha Price and narrated by Sarah Morrissey. Copyright 2016 by Samantha Price. Production copyright 2021 by Samantha Price.